What's up guys, my name is Jeremy and welcome to my new tutorial series, Learn Maya for Noobs, Chapter 1. In this video, I'm going to walk you through everything you need to know to create this little restaurant scene. So whether you're coming from a 3D background or you're brand new to 3D art, I'm going to walk you through all of the steps inside of Maya. That's right. By the end of this video, even you will be able to build this scene. My goal is to keep the instruction as concise as possible, but there is a lot of ground to cover, so bear with me. And rather than split it into chunks, I really want to keep this tutorial contained in one video. Maya is used for modeling, rigging, animation, lighting, rendering, and effects. Ideally, in this introduction, I'd like to touch on each of those topics a little bit. Primarily, we'll be using this beautiful pilot rig and Douglas the Corgi, as well as some free assets from FAB.com. And lastly, a free HDRI from Polyhaven. I still watch Maya tutorials to see how people are approaching it, and my general feeling is that starting with 3D modeling is the wrong way to go about it. Instead, I think it's much better to get an overall sense of what the program can do, the workflow, and how all the different parts fit together to create something. The final thing I'll say before we get into it is that if you are brand new to 3D, I highly recommend you check out my Chapter 0 where I talk about 3D concepts before we even dive into Maya. It's very important to distinguish between learning Maya as a 3D tool versus 3D concepts in general. So I highly recommend checking that out if you're brand new to 3D, and honestly, even if you have some experience in 3D, you should probably watch it too. And I'm genuinely not saying that for views, I really just want you to understand, because today's video is about using the tool as opposed to the theory of 3D. Maya can be thought of as the center of a solar system, orbited by dozens of plugins and other programs. All of the work and outputs of these various tools feed into Maya to create computer-generated imagery. It's a powerful, battle-tested and proven, legendary piece of 3D software. But it's not alone. There are other prominent solar systems like Houdini, Blender, Cinema 4D, and 3D Max that each have their own orbit of tools. Ultimately though, these days, all of these solar systems orbit two giant galaxies, Nuke for pre-render and Unreal for real-time. Alright, let's get started. Welcome to Maya 2026. Specifically, I'll be using Maya 2026.2, and our Arnold renderer version is M2A 5.5.4.2. This is the Maya to Arnold plugin version, but the actual engine underneath is Arnold 7.4.3.2. So just be aware of that, maybe check out your own version. You can follow this tutorial with any version of Maya. Just be aware that the more recent versions have some slight UI differences. For example, this button right up here may or may not exist on your UI, and I'll show you how to work around that when we get there. The agenda for this video is that I'm going to first introduce you to the Maya UI, then we're going to talk about navigation tools, animation, materials, lights, and rendering. Chapter 2 is where I'll go deep on modeling and the modeling toolkit, but I really don't think it's the most important thing to know right off the bat. This area here is called the viewport. This is where the action happens. You can hold Alt and left click to rotate the camera around. You can hold Alt and right click to zoom in and out. And you can hold Alt and middle mouse button drag to pan the camera around the scene. Alternatively, you can use the view cube by clicking and dragging to rotate around. You can tap the sides of the box to lock the camera to a specific view. And you can reset by hitting this little circle and arrow button. If you should ever find that you're off-centered like too much, you can always reset by hitting the home button on your keyboard. You can tap Alt-B to cycle through some preset colored backgrounds. This blue one is pretty classic Maya. And this is nice because depending on what you're working on, you may need more or less contrast. I'm going to leave it on the blue for now. These buttons at the top are your toolbox. These are called shelves. We've got curves, surfaces, poly modeling, which is where we're going to spend most of our time. Sculpting, you almost never use. UV editing, rigging, animation, rendering, effects caching, not going to use this either. Custom is a space for you to put your own buttons, but really you can add custom buttons to any shelf. Arnold, this is pretty important because it's the lights and the render that we're going to use, but there's a lot of different ways that you can access these same functions. Bifrost, Mesh, Motion Graphics, and XGen, these are all the hair tools. We're going to leave it on poly modeling for now. Let's create a box because the UI is actually not complete until you have an object selected. You'll notice that the upper right hand side of the screen filled out. This is the channel box and probably one of the most important parts of the UI. The whole right side of the UI is broken into 3 different sections. At the very top, we have the channel box. In the middle, we have shapes and inputs. And on the bottom, we have display layers. The channel box is one of the most important parts of the UI. We're going to use this all the time. The shapes and inputs you generally don't want to touch, but sometimes there are values to set here. And at the bottom is display layers. You can think of display layers as on or off switches for sets of objects in the scene. And we will be using this a little bit. Over on the right hand side though is one of the most important parts of the UI, and this is the outliner. This is where every object in the scene shows up. We use this for selection, grouping, and organization. On the upper left hand side of the screen we have the context menu. Currently we're set to modeling, so we have a couple of modeling specific options at the top of the menu. You can change this to rigging, animation, effects, rendering, and all it does is it changes the options available to you depending on what context you want to work in. Maya has a ton of hidden floating menu options. For example, if you press and hold spacebar, you'll notice that we get this massive menu. This is called the hotbox. And here you'll find every option from File, Save As, and all of the different context menus that I just listed. The first row here is modeling, next is rigging, animation, effects, and rendering. All of the context menus under one roof. You can tap spacebar to go to the quad view, and then you can hit spacebar onto any of these individual views to expand them to full screen. Alternatively, you can click over here to access the quad view, the split screen, and then back to the single. On the bottom of the UI, we have our timeline, and you can scrub through. You can increase the range or decrease the range to a specific set of frames if you want to zoom in. At the very bottom, we have a very helpful tooltip box, and this is really useful for telling you what a tool does or the next steps in an operation that you need to take. Then in the middle and on the bottom right, we have the expressions and command window. Here you can enter mel scripts. You can hit this mel button to switch it to Python code if you prefer. And down here is the command line. This will tell you if there's an error or problems. You can check this all the time for the status. This little button on the bottom right opens up the script editor, and this is extremely useful. Again, you've got access to mel and Python. We'll talk about this more later. Quick example of why the script editor is so powerful. I've got an object here and a Python script, and if I run it, I instantly get a 360 object. You can see the potential of how this cuts down on modeling time. Finally, on the upper right hand side of the UI, you've got some modeling tools. Human IK, these are rigging tools. Attribute editor, and tool settings. Tool settings is massive to the point where you might want to dock this. And finally, we have the channel box. And at the very top right, you can change your workspace to a couple of presets. Rendering standard, XGen, Mash. I pretty much always stay in general and then customize it as you see fit. Another important window is Windows, Settings and Preferences. This opens up all the settings for Maya. Probably some of the most important categories are color management, files and projects. This is where you can enable autosave, file references, and undo states. Another important one is Windows, Settings and Preferences, Hotkey Editor. The hotkey editor in Maya is pretty sweet, and there's a lot of customization you can do in there. Another important window is Settings and Preferences Plugin Manager. So if you have a plugin installed and you want to activate it, this is where you'd come to find it. And we'll be making sure that we have Substance installed because it makes it a lot easier to import materials and textures. So if you don't have this installed with Maya, make sure you go and download it, Substance Maya plugin. Finally, we've got render settings. This is very important. This is where you switch between CPU and GPU rendering. And lastly, we have Hypershade. This is where you create and apply materials to objects in your scene. Maya and all other programs are going through a bit of a transition period because right now we're transitioning to USD and LookDev. So there is this other additional window called USD that's very important because things are switching towards a different workflow. So just be aware of this USD layer editor. This is going to come into play down the road, as well as this LookDev X graph editor. The LookDev X graph editor is the modern equivalent of the Hypershade. Hypershade has been around for decades, but the modern workflow is shifting towards LookDev X, which allows you to create shaders and materials that can be applied to other software and look exactly the same. But the focus of this video is going to be on Hypershade and dealing with the classic workflow with Arnold and Hypershade. That pretty much covers the structure of the UI, but we'll discover the other parts as we go along. To move objects around, you can tap W to access the translate tool. So you can just grab one of these handles and move left and right, forward and back, up and down. Maya is Y up, X, Y, Z. You'll also notice that there's these three colored planes. You can use these to move an object around two axes at the same time. So in this case, if I wanted to move this object around the ground plane without giving it any elevation or height, I can just move it along there. Alternatively, I could use the red one to go forward and back and up and down at the same time. Another cool way to manipulate objects in Maya is to hold Shift and middle mouse button drag in the direction you want to go. So I can go forward and back, up and down, left and right. And this is really nice because I can be over here, the bottom right hand corner of the screen, and still manipulate the object the way I want to, right? And that's really cool because it means that you don't have to hit the gizmo each and every time. You can hit F to recenter your focus on an object. So you can hit F to recenter the camera. You can tap R to access the scale tool, and by clicking and dragging the center gizmo here, you can scale uniformly. Alternatively, if you don't want to scale uniformly, you can just grab one of the handles that you want. You can hit E to access the rotation tool. You can move like this. And you can hold J while rotating to snap to set intervals of 15 degrees. Another way to manipulate all of these different attributes is by using the channel box directly. So let's say I want to move or scale, let's select all the scale values. I can middle mouse button drag left and right to scale directly like this. Same works for rotation, Y-axis. And this is really cool because I actually think this is my preferred way to manipulate objects inside of the viewport, especially when you have rigged attributes. So we can also use this to zero out our values and get back to a perfect box. Now I also want to introduce you to channel box math. So let's say I wanted this box to be exactly 5 units larger. Maya uses centimeters, by the way. I can go to the channel box and I can type plus equals 5 and hit enter. And now my box is exactly 5 units larger than it used to be. Alternatively, I can also use percentages. So if I wanted this box to be exactly 50% smaller or half the size, I can type in minus equals 50%. And now my box is exactly half the size it used to be. This works on all the different attributes inside of the channel box. So if I want to move this box exactly 20 units to the left, I can hit minus equals 20. And now the box is exactly 20 units to the left. Very, very handy and powerful tool in the channel box. I also want to mention that you can increase and decrease the scale of the gizmos themselves. And this works on all of them by tapping on the plus or minus key on your numpad. And so this might make it easier depending on the scale of your model. You might find it easier to handle, literally. To duplicate an object, you can hit Control D. I'm just going to drag it off to the side. And then you can hit Shift D afterwards to duplicate the object while maintaining that first transformation that it made after it was created. So I can hit Shift D again and again and again, which means I can grab all these boxes, hit Control D to duplicate, move them up, and now I can just hit Shift D again and again to create a bunch of walls of boxes. So I can select all of this, hit Control D, offset, Shift D again and again and again, and pretty quickly it can generate a lot of different objects. And this is really cool because again, using the Shift middle mouse button drag, I can duplicate these objects and now I can just move walls and walls of objects around. Now I want to show you some group organization things. So this first group of boxes, I'm going to select them all. You can see that they're all selected in the outliner. I'm going to hit Control G to create a group. So group was created and now I can select the group and all of the individual components. For the second wall, I'm going to select all the different objects, but this time I'm going to shift right click and hit combine. And the difference between these two groups is that yes, I can select the outliner with the group and I can continue to move this group together. In this case, I can do the same thing. The difference is with the first one, it's just a group. So inside the group, I still have access to the individual objects, which means I get individual control of each box within this group. And if I move the group again, you can see that I have that box offset. However, with the merged group, the combined group, I can't do that anymore. This is now considered one object. So the only way to manipulate the boxes is to hit right click, go to faces, double click on the selection that I want to move. Now I can move a box over and go back out to object mode. So this one requires that I enter the sub object to manipulate the shape. This one is just a group of individual objects. It is possible to separate these objects back out though. So to do that, you can shift right click and go to separate. And you notice that what happens is that a group is created that houses all of these individual boxes. The main difference though is that the pivots have been readjusted. So if I click on the individual boxes of the grouped set, you can see that the pivot is still at the center of the box. However, on the split set, you can see that the pivot has been reset to world 00 space. I want to talk about pivots for a little bit. So here we have a sphere and you can see that the center is inside the sphere somehow. If you tap D, this allows you to edit the pivot of this object. And now when I hit D again and I try to rotate, you can see that this sphere is rotating off-centered. So to actually get your pivot back, you need to go up to Modify, Center Pivot, and now you can see that my pivot is located back in the center of the sphere. And just to show you that there's more than one way to do the same thing inside of Maya, I'm going to shift right click without anything selected, and this opens up the primitive creation menu. So from here you can create primitives directly into the viewport. I'm going to select plane, hit R to scale this up, and W to translate this off to the side. Now what I want to talk about are these magnets up at the top. These are your snapping options. So the first one here is snap to grid. So if I activate this, now my object will snap to the grid whenever it moves. You can also activate this by holding X on your keyboard. This is the hotkey. Now you may notice with this option selected, my pivot's not snapping directly onto the grid, like it's not moving the object vertically down. What it's doing is it's moving horizontally. So whenever you have snapping selected inside of Maya, Maya will snap to whatever your cursor is currently on. So if I want to snap to this far edge of the grid, I just simply drag my object, put my mouse over where I want it to snap to, and at least horizontally, now the pivot is snapped to that portion of the grid. If I want the actual center of the object to snap, then I have to drag down vertically and put that cursor directly on top. So if I want to move the object directly on top of the center of the world, I select the center of the object and I drag this over, physically moving it to the center. So this is kind of cool. You get the best of both worlds. So just move an object over. Let's say I want to snap to this front right corner. I simply drag the object with my mouse over with my cursor. And then if I need to move it down vertically, I can do that. So that's snap to grid. Alternatively, we can snap to vertices as well. So that's what this plane is for. I'm going to hit Alt-5, and this opens up wireframe on shaded. This is one of my favorite views to work inside of Maya because you can see the topology of the mesh as well as the shaded model. So with snap to vertices, now we can do the same thing, but with a plane this time. So in this case, you can either use this magnet option up at the top to click that and leave it on, or the preferred option is to probably use the hotkey. So you can just hold V to snap to vertices. And just to really drive this point home, I'm going to go up here to activate X-ray. And this allows us to see through the models. You can see that as I hold V and I move this object left and right, the object is perfectly centered over the lines. That's because the object is snapping on the vertice that my cursor was over. So this is how you can get really precise control of where exactly your model is inside of Maya. So two of the most important snapping options are snap to grid by holding X and snap to vertice by holding V. The final skill to master the manipulation of objects requires that we open the tool settings. For the translate tool, the rotate tool, and the scale tool, you can notice that there's a setting here at the very top that says axis orientation. This is extremely important. Let's switch to the translate tool and hit reset. By default, most of the time, the axis orientation is set to world space. In Maya, world space means that right is positive X, left is negative X, up is positive Y, down is negative Y, forward is positive Z, and back is negative Z. But if we take this box and we rotate it, and then we switch back to the translate tool, notice how the box is moving left and right contrary to its natural axis. That's because our tool settings currently has our move tool axis orientation set to world, so it's only moving in world space. To get the object to move in its more natural orientation, we need to set the axis orientation instead to object. Notice how suddenly this feels a lot better, and we can actually move the object in a more meaningful way to the object. This is just a cube, but imagine it was a person instead. Being aware of this object orientation setting is extremely useful. There's one final setting to grasp. If we shift right click on the cube and we go to target weld and we merge down these two vertices. Next, we're going to right click on the model and go to face and select this diagonal face, hitting Q for select. If I hit W to move for the translate tool, notice that the object axis orientation doesn't actually save us in this case. We can move left and right, but it doesn't feel natural to the face of the object because it's pointing off at an angle. This is where the third axis orientation mode comes in, component. Notice how now this is a much more natural way to manipulate this face. What's happening in this case is Maya is now moving the face according to the direction of the normals, which we covered in chapter 0. To visualize that, I'm going to go up to display, polygons, face normals. And you can see there's a tiny little line. Let's bump that up. Polygons, normal size. Let's jump that up to 10. Now you can see these little green hairs, and I'm going to turn on anti-aliasing so we can actually see it a little bit better. These are the face normals, which run perpendicular to every face. And this is precisely what the component axis orientation is taking advantage of. So we have world axis, object axis, component axis. Learning when to use each mode just takes a little bit of experience, but it's going to be very important in a few minutes here when we start manipulating the rigs. We have a few more features to cover, but we're almost there. I want to revisit the topic of floating hidden menus. One of the primary floating menus is simply to right click on your selected object. This allows you access to the sub-object of that model, as well as go back out to object mode. The other most important options on this menu are material attributes and assign new material. This allows you to create new materials directly on the model. Another menu is to shift right click on your model. This opens up a whole bunch of modeling tools, and these are very useful, particularly the smooth function. Notice the arrows on some of these menu items. This means that there are further options to explore. This is also a good time to point out that Maya has a very unique gesture system to access these marking menus. For example, I could shift right click to select anything on this list. However, you can also gesture. So if I wanted to soften the edges of this model, I simply hold shift and flick in the direction of those menu items. I am by no means a pro at this, but some Maya users are very comfortable with this method. If you hit the menu hotkey and then you quickly right click, you'll create a gesture mark. And this allows you to trace the path of the menus that you can't see. Another hidden menu is to hold Control and right click. This allows you to convert your selection to faces, to vertices, and to edges. Or you can simply flick in those directions. A lot of people claim that this gesture menu is quick and efficient once you get used to it. But personally, I don't find it any more efficient than simply key binding your various selection states for vertices, edges, and faces. I find that way more accurate. And you can set that by going up to Windows, Settings and Preferences, Hotkey Editor, typing in mask under Runtime Command. And here you can set hotkeys for vertex, edge, face. If you hit W to activate the move tool and hold it and then left click, you can see that we get another menu here. This one's quite useful. This allows you to switch the object space that we talked about previously. So for example, if I open up the tool window, you can see that by holding W and left click, I can switch to object, component, etc. You can also hit Q and left click to activate symmetry. You can hold A and left click for some other important buttons, primarily delete history and freeze transforms. We use those two all the time. And finally, with the move tool, once again, you can hold D and right click to access some pivot settings. I just want to point out that you never have to use these floating menus. These are simply there for your convenience. There are many other ways to access the same buttons. The two that you will be using regularly are right click as well as shift right click. The final hidden menu, at least that I'm aware of, is if you shift right click on the empty viewport with no object selected, you get this primitive creation menu. And that could be a faster alternative than going all the way up to the shelf. At the top of your viewport, you'll notice that there are a lot of different buttons. We won't talk about all of these just yet because they're not that relevant. However, these buttons over here are quite useful because these change the view state of the mesh. We can turn on wireframe on mesh, textured, and lit. This is the equivalent of hitting 1 through 7 on your keyboard. If you hit 1 on your keyboard, this is the default preview. 2 shows you a smooth preview as well as a low poly wireframe. 3 shows you just the smooth version, so we use this hotkey quite a bit. You'll usually bounce between 1 and 3 to preview what your model looks like at subdivision. 4 shows you wireframe completely, 5 is shaded, 6 is textured, and 7 is with lights. Because we have neither texture nor lights, nothing really shows up. But if we did, then we would see it. So 4, 5, 6, and 7 are the equivalent of all of these viewport buttons up here. 2 last minute details to know about the UI. If you open up any menu, you can tap this bar at the top, this little dotted bar, and this allows you to pop it into a floating window. So you can undock as many panels as you want. Then lastly, you'll notice that some of the menu items have a little box. This allows you to open up the options for that setting. So anytime you see this little box, you know that there's options to set for it. The final part of the UI that we're going to talk about before we get started is the attribute editor over here. The attribute editor is everything. It's extremely important. You can hit the shortcut Control A to bounce back between the channel box and the attribute editor, which you'll be doing a lot. So Control A is a must-have shortcut. Now you'll notice that the attribute editor has a series of tabs and you're probably thinking, what the heck is going on here? But there's actually a method to the madness. The first tab is always your transformation tab. This houses your translation, your rotation, and your scale. So everything to do with the transform values are always in this first tab. The second tab pertains to the shape. This has to do with the information in regards to the vertex, the edges, and the faces. The shape tab is really what the model is. And anything to do with altering the state or shape of the model occurs on this shape tab. So this is where you'll find things like your subdivision setting and displacement, because they are not transformation data, they are the shape. This third tab has to do with primitive initialization. This only appears when you first create an object. This allows you to set things like height, width, subdivision level, and this is just for the initial creation of your object. Once you delete history, this tab is gone. So, for example, if I go up here and I delete history on this object, you'll see that that tab disappears. Now all we have left are 4 tabs. The transform node, the shape node, initial shading group, this is the shading assignment, This is simply telling Maya this object is part of a group that will be assigned a certain material, and the final tab is the actual material that is currently assigned. In this case, the default OpenPBR gray shader. As you perform certain operations to a model, you'll notice that it starts to gain attributes. For example, I could go up to deform, nonlinear, bend. This allows me to bend my model. Now, if I go to my attributes tab, you'll notice that in addition to the transform, shape, that we have additional tabs, pcube shape 1 original and bend 1. These are operations that have been performed on the model, and their values are contained in these attributes. As I start to make changes to a model, pay attention to the input section. I'm going to delete a face and go back to object mode. Then I'm going to delete another face, back to object mode, delete a couple more faces. Notice that my object now has a bunch of inputs. My object had an original state, and then I performed a bunch of actions. To present you its current state, Maya has to run through all of these events every time. So it's common practice in Maya that as you work on a model, you'll occasionally want to delete this history. Notice that all the delete inputs and bend deformer have disappeared. Maya no longer has to evaluate all of those events, it simply sees the model in its current state as it is. By deleting history at various stages of your model when you're satisfied with it, you'll keep Maya and your model running smoothly. The final thing to mention about attributes is to look under the hood. We're going to go to Windows, Node Editor. This is really what's happening underneath the surface. If I select this cube and I go to the input connections, all of these nodes that you see here are the equivalent of these tabs at the top of the attribute editor. Whenever you see this slanted rectangle with the red arrow, this is a transformation node. By hitting these little icons, you can expand these attributes. So here you can see that we have the transformation node. This corresponds to the first tab in the attribute editor. We have the cube initialization node, the shape node, the shading group. The only thing missing is the actual material is not currently on this list. I want to focus just on the transformation nodes, so I'm going to select these nodes here and hit this minus button to hide them. They're not deleted, they're simply hidden. Next, I want to add the transformation node of the cylinder. So I'm going to hit the plus. Again, I don't need to deal with the shape. We want to leave the shape alone. We simply want to deal with the transformation. So I'm going to expand all the features by clicking on this little burger icon. And here's where we can start to do some interesting things. The node editor allows us to make connections and relationships between objects visually. So in this example, if I expand the translate values of the cube and expand the translate values of the cylinder, you could, for example, connect the translate x value of the cube to the translate x value of the cylinder. So now whenever I move the cube along the x-axis, the cylinder will adopt the exact same x position. Alternatively, you could do something a lot cooler. For example, you could say, I want the translate x value of the cube to drive the x rotation of the cylinder. So now when I move my cube left and right, you can see that it's rotating the cylinder. This establishing of relationships and connections between objects is the foundation of rigging. This is where you can introduce things like math nodes. So we'll add a multiply and a divide. And we'll basically say the x position goes in and out. So we'll say x goes to x and x out goes to rotate. And now we've got our value that's incoming at 1.5. We want to multiply that by 10. So now when I move my cube left and right, the cylinder is rotating at an amplified factor of 10. And you can go as crazy with that as you want. We could make this 50. Now you can see how erratic it looks like it's moving. Alternatively, you could slow it down. You could say 0.2. And now our cylinder is moving at a much slower rate. This is the power of the node editor. A lot of Maya artists, new or experienced, often ignore the node editor, but it's extremely powerful if you can come to grips with it. My main point in bringing it up was simply to establish the connection between the attribute editor with all these tabs equate to nodes inside of the node editor. And even though Maya is not fully node-based, such as programs like Houdini, be aware that there is a node system and can be used to great effect. It's finally time to start working with the rig. So if you haven't already, go ahead and download the Pilot Rig by Saeed Vasquez, as well as Douglas the Corgi by Brandon Shaw. But honestly, you can use any character rig that you want. Rigs come in all different shapes and sizes, but there are a couple of conventions that are pretty standard. For example, the colors of these controls themselves, you can see that there's always usually a blue side and a red side. Red typically for the right side, blue for the left side, and yellow for anything that's in the middle. Another thing that you'll notice is that we have display layers for the first time. We actually have stuff inside here. The first one here are controls, so you can toggle this on and off. And this is nice because sometimes you just want to look at the model. And then we also have geometry on a separate layer. The reason for this is so that the animator doesn't accidentally select the geometry. Because the character is fully rigged, the animator has no need to touch the actual geometry. Instead, we manipulate the control shapes. So standard practice is to set the geometry as a reference, indicated by this little R. So if we turn that off, now we can select the actual geometry, but we don't want to do that, so we'll put that back on. T is the same thing, except it sets to a wireframe, so switch that to R, now you can see the reference. The V simply toggles visibility, and the P stands for playback, so whether or not you want the animation to play when you play through the timeline. The first thing to do whenever you get a new rig is to just look at it. You want to see what kind of controls are available. So in this case, the first thing I usually touch are the hands. And you'll notice that the hand actually comes off in this particular case. And that's because when working with model, you have to be aware of what they call IK and FK. In this case, this is an FK, which means forward kinematics. It means that you move the control and the item follows, and that's it. But usually somewhere along the model, you'll find a switch. In this case, it's this little yellow box. And if you look at this attribute up here, you'll see something called an IK-FK blend. We're going to switch that to 0. And you may not notice what just happened there, but you see that the control shapes switched. What happened is that we switched from forward kinematics to the inverse kinematics. So now when I move this box on the hand, you can see that the arm responds to compensate for the movement of where I've positioned the hand. This is probably the preferred way to start working with a rig as a beginner. The same is true for the opposite side. By default, it's set to forward kinematics. So if I were to move this shape, the hand comes off. So we'll just hit this little yellow box and we'll turn on inverse kinematics. You'll also notice that the model right now is kind of hard to see with all these control shapes. The hotkey is Alt-1. Alt-1 disables the curves. It doesn't disable the layer, as you can see. It's simply a viewport setting. So Alt-1 is the equivalent of going up to Show, Viewport, NURBS, Curves, and that shows you the shapes. So if you want to get a better sense of what your model looks like, you can hit Alt-1 on your keyboard. Very, very handy. You might also find that the materials currently on the model are a little bit dark, and so you can use this button up here to turn on Default Shader, and that just makes it a little bit more unified to see. I think this model is absolutely stunning, and the rig itself is very nice as well. Some other things to notice is that things like tails, capes, or things that drag off the back are typically modeled completely straight. They're not modeled in a nice curve. That's because it's usually intended for the animator to put it into that position instead. It's a hell of a lot easier to rig a completely flat piece of geometry. I was hoping for a control to be able to manipulate that, but it looks like we have to do it manually to shape it. The legs and feet in this model are very interesting. So by default, they're set to inverse kinematic. So I can move the foot around and the leg will just respond. You'll also notice that on the knees as well as the back of the elbows, you have these triangles pointing out. These are called pole vectors and they indicate where the knee or the elbow should swivel. We also have this nice control down here by the ankle. You'll notice that all the translations are grayed out, but we do have the option up in the outliner. Again, I'm clicking this feature and I'm middle mouse button dragging left and right in my viewport. And you can see that we have this nice foot roll. This option box at the back allows you to switch between IK and FK once again. And again, these are pole vectors for the elbows that indicate which way they should swivel. It's always fun to explore a rig for the first time because sometimes there's some neat hidden features. So for example, right here, this little box has a wing fold attribute. So if I slide this in and out, I can pop the wings into resting position and then fold it out. Super cool. There's also this control on the top side of the hand. This is really nice for curling fingers. So if I select all the different fingers, middle mouse button drag in the viewport, I can create a fist. I can control all the fingers at the same time and create a fist. Moving up to the head, let's take a look at the face controls. I'm going to turn off the default material because I think we can see a little bit more detail here. So eyes are typically done this way. There's an eye mask that allows you to control the position of where the eyes are looking, both at the same time. But then you also have independent control as well. On this same control, there's also an option here to blink. So that's really cool. Or you can select multiple shapes here. Let's see if this works. Yep. So if you want to create blinks, you can do that through this control here. You also have smaller controls of the eyebrows. So usually, you want to, and you'll notice that animators typically would disable controls that they don't want you to interfere with. Notice that we can only pull along this direction. And that's nice because believe it or not, you can still go off model on a 3D model quite easily by pushing things a little too far. Now you'll notice that our model's gray, but what happened to the textures? As you saw in the preview, it has textures because it's colored. A lot of the times when you encounter this, it's simply because the Maya scene can't find where the textures are saved on this computer. So let's go up to Windows, General Editors, File Path Editor. You'll notice that we have a bunch of errors, 14 unresolved textures. So all we need to do is simply point to where the textures are now located on our computer. So we're going to go down to repath files, browse, go to your rig folder, and honestly you can just select that and hit set, and also tell it to search subdirectory for files and hit repath. Notice that suddenly we get all the full color of the character. This just makes it a little easier to see. So now we're going to set our first keyframes for animation. I've currently got 200 frames, that's enough for now. I'm going to drag this eye mask and we're just going to do a simple blink. So at frame 0, I'm going to have her looking off to the side. And I'm going to hit S to set a keyframe. Notice that that's indicated by all the red in the channel box. All of these attributes have been keyframed. If you don't want to set keyframes for everything, you can simply select the ones that you do want to set. For example, translate X, and then go to key selected. But for my purpose, I'm fine with setting keyframes for everything. So I'm going to hit S. By frame 36, I'll have her looking off to the other side. And then hit S once again. Notice that when you scrub through the timeline, our character is now looking left and right. You can also hit play to get a sense of what that looks like. Now let's get a little bit more complex. Let's say partway through this eye movement, I want her to blink, maybe about halfway. So at frame 14, I'm going to set a keyframe. At frame 16, I'm going to have her blink and set a keyframe. And then at frame 20, her eyes will be open again. Kind of a slow blink. And set a keyframe. Let's play that back. Cool, a little bit fast. I want the blink to be a little bit slower, so I'm actually going to hold shift and drag with left click along my timeline, and this allows me to move keyframes. So I've set my keyframe back a little bit, and now the blink is just a little bit slower. Now this is where you can get into the real nuance of animation. There's all kinds of things you can do. For example, I could say that right before she closes her eyes, I actually have a keyframe where her eyes get a little bit larger. Another thing you could do is you could offset the blinking so that both eyes aren't blinking at the exact same time. So what I can do is I can hit shift and drag along the timeline, and let's move these keyframes over by 2 frames. That's a little bit too strong, but you see where I'm going with this. And by building up these layers, you can start to see how your character comes to life. The next concept of animation that I want to introduce you to is I'm going to create 2 boxes here. I'm going to scale them up, move them off to the side. I'm going to set a keyframe for both on frame 0, and then at frame 30, we'll move it off to the side, hit S to set another keyframe. But on one of these boxes, I'm going to change it up a little bit. I'm going to go up to Windows, Animation Editors, Graph Editor. This is the animator's playground, and you can actually dock this on to your UI. So in this particular animation, we have a box moving only on its x-axis. I have one selected at the moment, so I'm just going to go to the Translate X. And this graph here shows me the movement of this keyframe. The keys are still starting at frame 0 in one position and moving off to the right by frame 30. But how we get there and how we're interpolating is determined by this graph. So notice that the rate of change at the beginning is a little bit lower, and then as the frames go on, it gets a bit faster, and then things slow down as it reaches the end. In animation, we call this ease out and ease in. By using the graph editor, you can manipulate this interpolation. So let's say instead of this S curve, I want to make it a completely linear animation. You can click this button up here. And now the rate of change is constant. So if we compare the 2 boxes with one still being on that S curve and the other one being completely linear, you can see that both boxes start at the same point and end at the same point. But how they get there is a little bit different. Notice that they're in different positions throughout the middle. And that's simply because of using the graph editor. And what this does is it changes how the animation feels. It changes the forces. And so every step of the way, the animators are concerned with this graph editor and how things transition between keyframes. If animation is your focus, then the graph editor should be your best friend. Next, I'm just going to take a little look at Douglas the Corgi rig. So this is a pretty important control here. Instead of dealing with the tail on an individual control level, you can use this gear to wag the tail. Very useful feature. Same thing with Douglas the Corgi, by the way. You can go up to Windows, General Editor, File Path Editor, and let's resolve these file paths. And again, hit Search Subdirectories for files. Notice how many inputs and outputs there are on a rigged model. In general, you absolutely never want to hit Delete History on a rigged character, because this can break connections. For fun, let's see what happens if I do that. I hit Delete History, and it didn't break anything, so that's good. In general, try to never hit Delete History on a rigged character. There's no need to do that. So you see this pretty often. There's usually a group control that moves multiple things at the same time, but then you also have the individual controls inside. You'll see this a lot too, where you have these two circles, one inner and one outer. Usually the outer one is for moving an asset to like really far into the world, because scenes can get quite large, and then you use the second one to actually move the character around in that space. But this one is used to get the character into the world position. So I'm still just doing a little inspecting just to get familiar with the controls. There seems to be a bit of an error on this rig where we have these teal balls that are there to control the mesh, but I don't think they're meant to be visible. And yet if I try to hide them, it's part of the control shape layer, which is not desirable. So really what should happen here, they seem to be called shapers. And really what should happen here is that we put them on their own layer. So what you can do is you can take that word shaper, search for it in the outliner, and you can hit shift on a group to fully expand all of its contents. Now, I could go through and select all these manually, but that is kind of annoying. There's got to be an easier way to do this. I can see them right there, but I don't want to be able to select control shapes. So maybe what I could do is I could disable curves. Now I can select all of these. And what I can do is I can create a separate layer with just these shapes on it. So now I can hit the visibility of just these shape layers, and now it's fixed. Here are some hotkeys when dealing with groups inside of the outliner. If you normally click on the plus of a group, it expands just the contents of that group. But if you want to see everything, you can hold shift and press that button. And now every single folder, subfolder below that is expanded. So you can see every single item inside of this list. If I close the group and I open back up, you'll notice that it's exactly the same. So how do we get back to how it used to be? You can hit Control Shift on a group to close it. And now when you hit the plus button, it'll unfold back to its normal state. So Shift to expand everything, Control Shift to reset that setting. Right now I can only see a set group. If I hit Shift, it expands everything in that. If I want to revert this to how it used to be, I hit Control Shift. And now when I hit the plus button just by clicking, you can see it's reverted. So Shift and Control Shift. I have a couple of best practices that are important to follow. Notice at the top of the viewport here, it says sRGB Gamma Legacy. This is the old color space and not what we want to work in. In general, when you open old files, you have no idea when they're from. Maya is like a 30-year-old program. And a lot of the times when people run into issues with Maya and they say, oh, Maya is so buggy, it's because they're working with extremely old files from 20 to 30 years ago, or potentially even 10 years ago. And over time, nodes just become deprecated. So usually when I'm working with a rig and I don't know when it was from or what settings the person used, I like to start with a brand new file. So to properly set up the characters for the scene, follow these steps. We're going to go to File and we're going to import the character instead. So I'm going to go to the pilot rig. Pause. This is Jeremy from the future, and I realized I made a mistake here. I should have unchecked use namespaces. For this particular setup, when you're bringing an asset into a fresh new scene, uncheck the namespace. If you're working in a large scene, then you can leave it on. Some of the work I do in the next few minutes could have been avoided if I just unchecked this box. I forgot. I'm sorry. So I'm going to go to the pilot rig and import this file. Now we're going to go up to Windows, General Editors, File Path, and do the same thing we did before. We're going to repath the textures. Notice the color space is aces. This is desirable. And we're going to go to File and Save As. We're going to save the file as a new version inside of the pilot folder. I'm just going to call it Pilot V01 Master. Now in Maya, we have multiple file types. We have Maya ASCII and Maya Binary. In general, you should probably save working files as Maya ASCII. These are readable, which means if the file crashes, you can open the file in a text editor and make edits. Whereas if you save it as binary, you can't do that. However, binary files load faster. And typically the advice is to save your iterations as Maya ASCII, and then when you're finally done with the asset and you don't plan to author it anymore, switch it to Maya Binary because it loads faster. For now, we're going to do Maya ASCII, so .ma. You'll also hear teachers talk a lot about file, set project. And it probably is a good idea to set project, but we're not ready to do that just yet. Because all I'm doing is first setting up the character scenes, and when it's time to make our actual restaurant scene, then I'll set project. I'm going to create a new scene, and I'm going to do the exact same thing with the Corgi as well. I'm going to go to Rig, and we're going to import not the proxy, but the actual version. Then we're going to go to Windows, General, File Path Editor, repath the files, find Douglas, the folder, set, make sure search subdirectories for files is on, hit repath, and make sure our textures are on. Then we're going to File, Save As, Rig, Douglas, and I'm just going to call this Douglas Master. Save. And real quick, I'm just going to fix those teal balls. So I'm going to create a new layer, hide the geometry, hit Alt-1 to hide the curves, select all of these shapes, right click, add objects to selected layer. So now the balls are on a separate layer, and I'm just going to call this hide. Now there's only one thing going on here, and this is worth mentioning because you'll probably run into it if you import the character as I did. You'll see that the names look a little bit confusing. You can see that things have gotten more complex. This is an indication of a namespace. So when I imported the file, every item in that file now has this label inside of the outliner, and things can get kind of cluttered. So the way to fix that is to go to Windows, General Editors, Namespace Editor. And you'll see we have this thing here, Douglas, because when we imported, it brought in the file name with it. And I'm just going to hit delete. You want to go to merge with root. So what it's going to do is it's going to remove the file name and then have everything the way we expect it to be. And now this looks a lot better. And I'm going to rename these layers because when we merge the files together in the restaurant scene, we have two character rigs that will both say anim and geo, so make sure that they're identified. Now that we've had a chance to look at our rigs, it's time to start thinking about lighting and materials. So I'm actually going to disable this display layer because I want to be able to click on the geometry. And I'm going to hit right click material attributes to see what kind of materials we got going on here. And actually better yet, let's just open the hypershade. So as you can see here, the hypershade is actually filled with materials right now. And we have something here called the body mat blend. So even just by mousing over, you can see what shader is being used. And in this case, it's a blend, which is not great because that's an old school shader. To show you what that looks like, let's set up some lights for the first time. We're just going to go up to Arnold, lights, and create a physical sky. This is a digital sky. And we're just going to go up to our render settings with this clapperboard and the gear. And we're going to switch our system from CPU to GPU rendering just because it's a little bit faster. And then we're going to hit this little button that I mentioned at the very start of the tutorial, this little A. And now we can see what the character looks like under some light. Now we can select the light and let's actually just bump up the exposure. I like to set it to 2, just so that it's a little bit brighter. So our character is looking a little bit shiny and not as convincing as we'd like it to be. As you can see on his body, he's essentially glass. He's reflecting the world around him. And that's because we're using that blend material. We want to convert that to an Arnold shader. Thankfully, Arnold has tools for this exact purpose. You can go up to Arnold, Shaders, convert legacy shaders to Arnold. Convert all shaders in the scene or selected shaders. We're going to hit all. Okay, so you can see that they're switching right now. And now when I put my mouse over in brackets, you can see that it's an AI standard surface shader. That's what we want to work with. So now if we try to render this, let's give it a check. And while the colors are looking a little bit better, you'll notice that they're still reflective. That's not so good. So even though our shader is converted to Arnold, there's one more step that you need to take. So we're going to go to our body material. And if you scroll down, you'll find a tab called coat. And you want to set this value all the way to 0. And this is what our dog should look like. This is just a byproduct of the shader conversion. Blend doesn't have a coat setting. And so when it converts, it doesn't really know where to put the coat. So we manually have to set the coat to 0. So we're going to do that for every single material real quick. So I'm going to select each material here and just make sure the coat is set to 0. You'll also notice that the model is looking a little jagged at render time. That's because it currently has no subdivision settings. So let's put some on our dog. Look at the faceting going on here at the nose, the faceting going on at the eyes. We want this to look a lot smoother at render time. So select the mesh of your model, and under the shape tab, again, that's the second tab, you can go to Arnold, scroll down, subdivision, and here where it says none, you can set this to Cat Clark. That's the subdivision algorithm that we want to use. And set iterations to either 2 or 3. I'm going to go with 3 for now. So that's the body. You could probably do the eyes as well. Let's do Cat Clark. Now the thing with setting subdivision, you have to do this for every single object in the viewport. Like you can't do multiple at the same time. And if you want to do multiple at the same time, you have to use a different window for that. And that can be found under Windows, General Editors, Attribute Spreadsheet. It's a little bit complicated, so I won't get into it right this minute, but just know that you can set subdivision for every object found in the attribute spreadsheet. For now, I'll just do it manually. So Cat Clark 3, Cat Clark 3. And now we'll just do another preview, and we can see that our nose is smoothed out and our eyes have smoothed out as well. I completely forgot to mention that if you don't have this Arnold button under your UI, the way to get past that is to go up to Arnold here at the top and go to Open Arnold Render View. This opens a separate window that allows you to hit play, and when you do that, you can start to see the exact same render that we saw before, but in its own pop-up window. Modern versions of Maya have Arnold Preview built directly into the viewport. So you still can swivel around and it'll still update. I think our character is fixed up for now. There's a couple more changes I want to make actually, but I'm good for now. I'm going to delete the lights so that it's not brought into every scene and hit save. Going back to the pilot character, I'm just going to make a couple more tweaks real quick. I'm going to fix the namespace again. Namespace editor, delete, merge with root. I'm going to add the name, pilot, geolayer, and I'm also going to check the materials I didn't actually check before. In this case, this character is actually made with AI standard surface, so this is perfect. This is going to render perfectly right out of the box. So we're going to create another physical sky. I'm going to hit A, and I'm going to bump up the exposure to 2. And notice how it's kind of annoying that you can't click anywhere anymore because of the sky dome. If you don't want to have to see the sky dome, but you still want the effects of it, you can go down at the bottom here in the shape tab, click on viewport, and change the sky radius to 0. So now I can't click on the sky dome inside of the viewport, but if I hit this button, I still get the light contribution. And real quick, I'm just going to make sure my device is set to GPU rendering under system. And now I can switch. And now we can see our character fully rendered. This character looks great. I'm going to delete this light. I'm also going to delete this bottom camera. We don't need any extra cameras. And I'm going to hit save. Let's do a little crash course on Arnold lighting and materials because that's what we're about to get into soon. So I'm going to create a ball and just make a copy with Control D, Shift D to make a repeat of those copies, Control D the whole row up to make a second row and one more row as well. Next, I'm going to apply an Arnold material by going to Assign New Material, Assign New, Arnold AI Standard Surface, and then I'm just going to hit G to repeat last action. This just makes it a little bit quicker. I still have to select it every single time, but it just helps to speed it up just a touch. I'm doing this because I want to create a unique material for every object and give it its own unique properties. And this will give us a nice little sample to play with. Next, I'm just going to go up to Arnold Lights, create a physical sky. I'm going to click on this and hit Control A to get to the attributes, set the exposure to 2, and I'm going to go down to the bottom, set the sky radius to 0 so I don't see it. And then I'm going to go up to System and make sure that GPU rendering is on and hit the Arnold preview. So now I've got a little scene. I'm just going to hide the grid. And I can start playing with these objects to see how they may look different. So the first ball, I'm just going to leave pretty basic. And really all I want to talk to you about are some of the main properties here inside of this shader. We won't talk about everything. I just want to talk about the main ones. So the first setting that I want to talk about on this first ball is roughness. By having higher roughness, you'll notice that you get a duller material. The next property I want to show off is metalness. So if we crank up the metalness, obviously it looks a little bit more like metal. The next is transmission. This makes the object look like glass. And on this next row, we're going to deal with dark materials. So we'll switch the base color to a black. I'm just going to do that real quick on all of them. And here you can see the effects of having a high roughness value. So if I bump up the roughness, you can see that the specular highlight is pretty much gone. It's a very matte looking object. On this object here, we'll bump up the metalness to see the effects on a dark base color. And on this one, we'll set the transmission to a weight of 1. Notice that the object becomes clear. So the base color really has no bearing on a transmission object. In order to affect the color of the transmission, you have to set the color underneath the transmission section. So let's make it maybe like a kind of teal color, something like this. Cool. The next property is emission. So let's go down to the tab. We're going to go down to emission, set the weight to 1, and we'll set the color to something orange. And the best way to see it, there's not really much to see right there. We can hide this light by hitting H on the sky dome light, and here you can see the effects of the emission. You can also bump the weight of the emission beyond 1. Let's go 5. And here you can see how that affects the scene. So if I wanted to dim the light by setting this exposure of the light to, let's say, -2, you can see the effects of having the emission on the shader. Very cool result. Next, on this material, we're going to deal with subsurface scattering. So let's look for a subsurface. Let's bump up the weight to 1. The subsurface color is like, you can think of that almost like the base color. We'll make it sort of a skin tone. And then the radius is that kind of reddish tint that comes through when it's in direct light, especially in thin areas of skin. This is a subsurface material right here. Also used in other things like plastic and marble. So it's not just skin, anything that's sort of slightly translucent. And here as well, you can play with the roughness setting so it's not as shiny. Lastly, I want to just show you that there are some presets inside of Arnold, so you don't have to make materials from scratch. So we've got things like gold, and you've got things like orange juice, or we could do, let's see, the skin shader. We've got some other presets, velvet, diamond, deep water. And so this is what the shader can do for you, is create all these different looking results. This is without any textures and purely messing with the shader parameters. So this was just using an Arnold skydome light, but the other most important light to be aware of is the area light. So we're going to create a new area light. And you'll notice that it has very little effect. In fact, it has 0 effect because by default, lights that come into Arnold have no brightness value set at all under the exposure. So we can bump that up, and even if you set it to 5, you won't see much. It's not until maybe 10 or 12 on the exposure you'll start to see. So we can actually hide the skydome light, and now you can see the effects of the area light. Just be aware that every time you set 1 unit of exposure, it doubles the amount of light. So it's kind of like f-stop. So let's do 11. You'll notice how much brighter that gets. You could do something like 15, and that's starting to get overexposed. So this is how you start lighting objects inside of Arnold. It's very, very easy to get started. Extremely powerful renderer here inside of Maya. To begin our project, I'm actually going to follow the proper workflow, which is to go up to File, Set Project. And I'll just create a new project folder inside of my rig category. Let's call it Dinner for Two Project. And we're just going to hit Set and Create Default Workspace. Now I'm going to save the scene. It's already going to default to the correct folder location, and I'll just call this Dinner for Two V01. So now we have our project. I'm going to introduce you to something new when dealing with files, and that is to create references. I'm going to bring the characters into the scene, but I'm not actually going to import the geometry and all the assets into the scene itself. And when working on large scenes, you typically want to create reference instead. So we're going to go down here to create reference. Now I'm going to locate my first character. Let's find the pilot, pilot master, and reference. Again, there's this namespace option. Because I know that everything is nicely labeled inside of the scenes, I don't need to use the namespace. So I'll just hit reference. And it's going to look just like I have the character inside my scene. I'm just going to activate textures. But you'll notice that there's this little diamond icon now on the folder, and that means that it's a reference. So you can actually unload. You can also go ahead and modify this character file on its own, and it'll update inside of my scene. So that's the purpose. It also keeps the file size really light inside of the larger scene here because it's not importing the geometry directly. You'll notice that we also have our display layers. Next, I'm going to bring in the dog, create reference, go up to Douglas, Douglas master, reference. Remember, these are the versions of the files that I created that are clean. You don't have to do that step, although I highly recommend it because the materials won't render correctly. Just be aware of that. The first thing to check whenever you're making a scene like this is to verify the scale. I don't know how tall this character is. So one way that you can do that is let's go to the front view, and I'm going to create a measure. So go up to create, measure tools, distance tool. I'm going to place it roughly where her head's at. Looks about right. And then I'm going to click down at her feet, and I'm holding X just to snap to grid so I can get a more accurate location there. And she's 175 centimeters, which is perfect. So this character is actually proportionate. And that's important because when dealing with rendering, you want things to be physically the correct world scale. It doesn't matter exactly how big the dog is as long as it's proportionate to the character here. I could maybe make him a little bit bigger, but for the most part, it looks pretty good. Sweet. So now we have 2 characters in the scene. I'm just going to go up to my render settings real quick before we do any kind of rendering and make sure that it's set to GPU, which it is. I'm going to go ahead and save this. The next thing I want to create is our HDRI light. So I'm just going to go up to Arnold, Lights. Instead of physical sky, we're going to pick Skydome, which is the same thing, except it's not a virtual sky. Hit Control A, and here we want to go up to Color and hit this little checker box. We're going to select File because we have an HDRI image that we want to import. So we're just going to go to our assets here and go to our HDRI folder. I downloaded a couple, but I think the one I want to use is Warm Restaurant Night 8K. One of the key factors for using HDRs is to make sure that the color space is set correct. My Maya defaults to RAW for HDR image files, but depending on how the image was made, your HDRI, you might want to try Scene Linear Rec 709 sRGB. And if you do go with Scene Linear sRGB, just make sure you hit Ignore Color Space File Rules. This will override your Maya default settings for this file type. I'm just going to leave it on RAW for now though. So we can delete our measurement for now because we don't need it. Height was good. And let's do a simple render here just to see how things are looking. The first time that you start a render, it'll be the slowest because it has to create the TX files. Right here it says running make TX. And basically what that means is that the render is converting the file to a TX format because it's easier for it to process at render time. Instead of dealing with all these different encodings for different file types and images, it just uses TX as its base. Cool, so that's looking pretty cool. And just so you know, we're not just going to use this HDRI image for the lighting. We're kind of using it more for reflections and overall mood, but we're still going to use some of our own Arnold lights, area lights to direct it a little bit more ourselves. Again, I'm just going to go up to the Skydome light here and I'm going to hide it from the viewport because I find it too distracting to work with. I'm just going to set the sky radius to 0, and that way it doesn't show up in my viewport. I know it's there, I know it's contributing, so I don't need to see it at all times. Plus, I hate not being able to click the background to deselect without clicking it. Okay, he's looking nice and clean. Now, one of the things I would do to him to make him look a little less plain is that I would actually add fur to him to make it more interesting. That might be beyond the scope of this video, but definitely something that you might want to consider if you want to flesh this guy out a little bit more. He could look real good. I forgot to mention that I might have changed the scale of the grid. So you can right click on the grid options here. And by default, actually, let's just see what is the default. Hit apply. So your grid probably looks like this, a little bit invisible. So I decided to make it a little bit larger. I'm going to set the scale to 200 units, so that's 200 centimeters. And if you don't like all these lines, you can disable the amount of subdivisions so it's a little bit cleaner. So you can set subdivisions on the grid to 1, and now we get a much simpler grid. And this is just much more practical for the real world scale that we're working at. So I'm going to move our character off to the side, and I'm going to position the characters roughly in the orientation that I kind of think that they're going to be in. Essentially, they're just at a dinner table. That's it. Pretty simple. And I'm thinking the table is going to go here into the middle of the scene. So now we need to create a table. But before we do that, we're going to start bringing in some of the assets that we downloaded. The first asset we're going to import is the chair. So I made a separate folder than the rigs called tutorial assets, and that's just where I'm going to put all the stuff that I download. So we've got this wooden chair. I'm going to import the FBX, and it has a bunch of textures, but the textures don't come in by default. Let's just rename this as well. I'm just going to call this chair_geo. So this means that we have to create the material from scratch, and this is where the substance plugin comes in. Reminder that we have to go to settings and preferences under Windows, go to plugin manager, make sure that you have the substance plugin installed. Now, there is obviously a way to do it manually, but it's not necessary in this day and age because we have this tool. So what we're going to do is go up here to substance, and we're going to go to apply workflow to maps. And what it's looking for are these different maps to create a material for you. You select the workflow. In this case, we're going to be using Arnold. So we're going to use Arnold and hit select multiple maps. So what you can do is just look for all the image textures here. Let's sort it. You'll have less than this. This is just a preview that I tried. So ignore all the TX in my list here. We're just going to select all the JPEG. Now, it's not going to use all of these necessarily. These are just the maps that were provided by FAB. So things like the AO, it's not going to necessarily use it directly in the shader, but you can use this image as a mask inside the shader if you want to. So we're just going to hit select. So notice that there's no metallic, there's no, like we can set an ambient occlusion for this one. So we're just going to hit apply. Now you'll notice that nothing changed with our chair. That's because the substance plugin doesn't apply it to any objects. It just creates the material for you inside of the shader. So if we open up Hypershade, you notice that we have a new material here called AI Standard Surface. I'm just going to call this wood chair. I also never mentioned before, but every single object inside of Maya is uniquely named, including materials. So you can't have a material that has the same name as the geometry in the scene. Every single node in Maya has a unique name. So now that we have our material, actually let's just graph it out to see what the plugin did for us. Here we have our shader. This is the shader engine. We have our roughness map. We have our base color. We have our AO. And we have our normal. Normal is probably one of the most important things here. Let's see what happens when we apply it. You can hit 6 on your keyboard to enable textures in your viewport. Cool. And it's always good to do a little lighting check. Let's add a physical sky. And let's click on our physical sky here. Let's bump up the exposure to 2. Okay, that's looking pretty good. And we've got our first imported asset. It's as easy as that. Now you don't have to do this, but I'm just going to create a simple rig for our chair, because you can position an object in the scene just by clicking it and moving it around as we normally do. But the proper method is to create a rig, even for basic objects. So I've switched over to the curves tab, and I'm going to create 2 circles, and I'm just going to scale them up. Now in general, whenever you have control shapes, you never want to have any kind of transformation or scale factor on it. But I'm going to freeze transform on these when I'm done. So I'm kind of being a bad influence on you right now. I just want 1 large circle and 1 inner circle. Make it roughly the shape of the chair itself. Now I'm going to go back to the poly tab and delete history and freeze transform. Same for the inner one. Delete history, freeze transform. Next, I'm going to select the circle, hit Control A, go to Object Display, or rather Drawing Overrides, and then hit Enable Overrides. And what I'm looking for is down here under Color. I just want to be able to select a color of my own. So I'm going to make this like, say like a bluish kind of teal. And then for this shape, I'm going to do the same thing, Enable Overrides. Instead of index, I'm just going to switch to RGB. I'm just going to make it kind of like an orangey color. And I'm just going to call this control chair global control and chair world control. Next, I'm going to hit Control G individually on each of these and expand them so you can see each control shape has its own group. I'm going to copy the name to the group. So it's the same thing, except I'm just going to add the word group to it. So chair global control group. Next, I'm going to do the same thing for this one. Chair world control underscore group. And finally, I'm going to put this inner circle because I want it to be a child of the larger circle. I'm going to take this group, middle mouse button, drag it into the shape. Okay, so I'm taking this second group of the inner circle and dragging it into the larger circle. And what that does is it means that wherever the larger circle moves, the inner circle also moves, which is what I want. However, I'll still have independent control of the inner circle. And even when it's offset, if I move the larger circle, it'll move with it. That's exactly what I want. The last thing I'm going to do is hit Control G on the chair, and I'm going to call this chair geo group. And finally, I'm going to select this inner world control, select the group of the chair, not the chair itself, but the group of the chair. Switch the context to rigging, constrain, and parent. Notice that a parent constraint is formed. That means wherever this little inner circle moves, the chair geo group will also move, allowing me to move the chair around. Okay, this is a very, very basic rig, and it's a little complex for what we want to talk about. I'm just showing you what I would normally do for an asset just like this. Last thing I'm going to add right now is if you actually try and scale this, nothing's going to happen. So I'm going to select this world control. I'm going to select the chair geo group. Again, not the geo itself, but the group, constrain, and scale constrain. So now when I scale this control, the chair actually scales with it, and it's just a nice feature to have. So I've got two folders. We have the control group and we have the geo group. There could be other geometry in here. I would also throw it into the geo group, and we essentially have a rig. So now I'm going to select both of these groups because I don't want two nodes in the outliner every single time I import an asset. I just want one node. So I'm just going to call this chair rig. Done. So make sure everything is zeroed out. You don't want any transformations. That's for the animator to have that. Notice that we can move this larger control. We have full control of the chair. Even if we position off, we can still have this inner control to give it a little bit more. And I'm realizing that this color is absolutely terrible because I can't see it against this background, but it'll be fine for now. The last thing I'm going to do is save this, and really I should have set project because we do have texture references in this case. I'm going to hit set project, tutorial assets, wooden chair, set project, create default workspace, file, save. We're not in the correct folder, chair master, and we're done. Back inside our main restaurant scene, I want to import this chair. So I'm going to go to file, create reference, tutorial assets, wooden chair, chair master, create reference. And you can see our chair pops into the scene. I just noticed that the chair is facing off to the right instead of to the front. A little bit of a mistake, but that's okay. We're just going to rotate this chair 90 degrees. I feel like our chair might be a little bit small, so I am going to scale it up a little bit. Now I want to create a second chair for the dog. So I'm going to do the same thing, file, create reference, chair master, bring it in again. Notice that when you bring in a second reference of the same file name, it just adds a number to the end. So in this case, the second chair is called rig1. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to scale it up by 15%. And so now we've got two chairs, but what we need is a table. But this is perfect because now the character at least can sit down. And hopefully you can start to see how this is coming together. We're just gradually adding assets to build our little scene. What we need to do now is build a table. I'm just going to switch the context back to modeling, and we're going to create a cylinder. Now the proper workflow is to use this initialization thing. So radius 30, a little too small, maybe 100, maybe a little too big. Let's go 80. That's a little more comfortable maybe for the two of them. Possibly a little small, 90. Let's do 85. That feels about right. Subdivisions, we want it relatively smooth, but not too smooth because we're going to be subdividing anyway. 40 looks pretty good to me. Let's do the height. Let's do a height of maybe 8. A little too thick. 5 actually seems about right. Perfect. So we got ourselves a little table. Now subdivision caps is kind of interesting. It's how many inner circles do you want? I actually do want a couple of inner circles. So in this case, I'll put subdivision caps of, let's do 6. That's good for me. I'm going to go rounder. I'm going 48. And when you're happy with it, I'm going to go ahead and actually delete history and freeze transform. I want to get rid of that initialization. And why I want this table is because now we need to set a table cloth, but we're going to need to do a little blocking in to determine the approximate height. Our chairs might be a little too tall. So let's just get our chair and our character roughly into position. If the character was sitting like this, suddenly our table is way too tall. Our chairs may be too tall as well. Let's just set that back to 1. And this is where disabling textures come into play, because I can't really see where she's contacting the chair exactly. It's a little bit dark, so you can just hit 5 on your keyboard. This allows you to get a better view. So she's clipping through the chair right now. So the chair is a little bit too tall for her. I guess I'll have to shrink it a little bit more, but it just seems so small to me at the default setting. I guess that's about right, actually. So chair size of about 1, default size was fine. I'll just set that on my other chair just for consistency. And now the table is looking absolutely gigantic, so we can lower this down. And for our dog, let's just move him into position as well. I'm either going to have him standing on the chair and like popping up onto the table, or I'm just going to have him on the table directly, which isn't proper etiquette, I know, but you know. Now this is where you have to kind of start thinking about composition, and probably one of the better things to be doing right now is to be working with the actual camera that we'll be using to frame this final shot. I have no concept yet of exactly what shot I want, but it might be a good idea to start having that in addition to our perspective camera. So down at the bottom, you can always see what camera you're working in. In this case, I'm going to create a new camera. You can go up here to Panels, Perspective, Create New. So this is going to be our render camera, and by default it actually just looks like a second perspective camera. There's nothing special about it, but here we're going to call this the render cam, and as you can see, we're in the render cam. And on this particular window, we're going to use the options that we haven't talked about yet, which is to use these options at the top of the viewport here. So finally, these are relevant. We've got film gate and resolution gate. You can pretty much always ignore film gate. That's like old school ratio. We don't want to work with that. What you want to work with is resolution gate. So resolution gate shows you the aspect ratio that you're going to be working with. And this is determined by the settings that you have under your render settings under common. So right now the preview is set to 540 pixels by 960. You can set that obviously to 1080, but the ratio is the same. So this is good for now. If you hit Control A with your render cam selected, you can go down to display options and set your gate color mask. Personally, I like it completely dark. You can also change the opacity if you want to see through it at all. I like a pretty dark mask because I want to see exactly what's going to be rendered inside the shot. So you can think of this as like your real director's camera here. And you can also set things like focal length and all that. For now, I just want to get a rough sense of the composition because this is going to help me determine how large this table should be. So with this focal length and everything, she's looking a little just overall small to me. And I'm wondering if the table is just too big for our purposes here. I also want to point out that you can use Alt-Z to undo camera moves. So let's say I zoom in real close to her and I'm like, oh, I actually wish I could go back without hitting undo because undo won't do anything. If you hit Alt-Z, you can backtrack through your camera movements. So Alt-Z to undo camera moves. You can also bookmark camera views. So let's say I like this shot and I want to be able to come back to it anytime. I just hit this bookmark button. Now I can zoom into something completely unrelated, and I could use the undo states, but I could also just right click, hit camera view right here, and now I'm back to where I bookmarked. So this is really nice, you know, especially when you're kind of searching for your shot. Maybe set a couple bookmarks so that way you can just bounce back and forth between your different camera angles. So anyway, back at the task at hand, we can leave this camera where it is and switch back to our perspective camera. So this is kind of like the work camera where we do our stuff, and then our render cam is off to the side here. Now this is a teeny tiny little icon. You can change this. So we have the render cam selected and I want to change the scale. So you can go down to object display under the shape, and let's bump that up. I'm going to make this something huge. I'm going to make the camera 30 just so that we can really see where it is. And I'm going to make this table a little bit smaller. I'm not going to shrink the height and overall scale. Like I'm not going to do a uniform scale like this. I'm actually just going to shrink it along 2 axes at a time without shrinking the height. So I'm going to use this bottom plane here to shrink along 2 different axes. So let's go down, like let's say like that much. And I like this because the smaller I make the table, the bigger the girl looks in the frame, which is good because I want her to have more prominence. I'm also going to scale the height just a little bit. Now notice when I scale the height, it scales down into the center of the object. If I don't like that, I can change the pivot by hitting D like we talked about before. I'm going to hold V to snap to the top, and I want the scale to go towards the pivot. So this way that level of the table doesn't change. And if I shrink it, it shrinks the height, but it's only shrinking up towards the top. I don't want to shrink the overall height because I like the height placement that it's currently at. So now we have a bunch of transformations done to this object, this table. I'm going to go ahead and freeze transformations and delete history. Now the table is just seen as it is. And this is looking a little bit more proportional to me. I'm happy with this. Now what we're going to do is create our tablecloth. So I'm actually going to hide our characters so that we can focus just on the table. And I'm going to create a plane, shift right click plane, scale this up. And we're going to want this to be a little bit bigger than the table itself, maybe something like that. And I want to subdivide this so we get a lot more resolution in this grid. So we're going to shift right click and go to smooth. And let's do 3 or 4 subdivisions. I think we'll do 3 for now. And I don't want any of this transformation information in this, so I'm going to freeze transform and delete history. And what we're going to do for the first time is our first effects. So we're going to go down to the effects context window, and we're going to go up here to nCloth and hit create nCloth. And so what that does is it tells Maya, hey, I want to simulate you. You can see there's this orange bar on the bottom, and I hit play. Our fabric is simulating through, but it has nothing to contact with until we set that. So we're going to tell the table, hey, you are going to be a passive collider. So we're going to go up here to nCloth and hit create passive collider. And so now you can see this little simulation is caching on the timeline. That's what's indicated by this orange bar. So I can play the simulation up to this point. Right now we have 250 frames or 130. So I'm just going to expand this, make sure that it goes all the way through. And let's go ahead and hit play now and see what happens. And you can see that we start to get some really nice cloth simulation going on here. Now we do have to let it run because it ended at about 110, so I'm just going to let it run through. And actually I probably want about 500 frames just so that we give the cloth enough time to settle, because obviously like we don't want our tablecloth to be frozen in this position. So let's just give it a minute here and let it simulate. I'm just going to expand the time range. And what we'll do is after it's done simulating, we'll just pick a frame that we want to be our final tablecloth. So it's looking pretty good, simulating pretty nicely. You see how these edges are kind of curling in? Maybe we want that to settle just a little bit more. The higher resolution you make this mesh, the nicer the simulation is going to look, but it potentially might be too dense for your computer to calculate. So I think 3 subdivisions is good. I could maybe use 1 more. We're obviously going to smooth this at render time, but some of these folds, I wanted maybe a little bit more resolution in the folds itself. Now, while that's simulating, I'm going to hit Control A on this. You can see that we have an nCloth node as well as an nCloth shape. nCloth shape is where you can set all kinds of properties, and this will determine how the cloth is simulating. There's even some presets here, so some different material presets like silk, concrete, heavy denim, burlap, all kinds of things. And then also we have the nucleus, and this has to do with gravity and time attributes. So there are some things to play with, but we're just going to use default settings for now. All right, let's take a look at our simulation. So let's see how it looks. Just want to get a frame where it settles down nicely. That's pretty good. So I'm okay with anything after like 300. I think frame 300, that's pretty nice for a tablecloth. It's looking a little bit small though. I almost want to make the cloth a little bit bigger, so I think I will do that. And so what I can do is go up here to nCloth, remove nCloth, and that takes it away. So let's go ahead and scale this just a little bit. I just want a little bit more drapery on the sides. It was looking a little bit small. So just a little bit. How much did it go up? I went up by about 5%. Freeze transformation, delete history. And we're just going back up to nCloth, create nCloth, and we'll just let the sim run again. So once again, I think I like frame 300. I'll go with this. Now, once an object has nCloth attributes on it, things can get a little bit finicky. So you'll notice that we have a lot of different nodes on top of our mesh right now. I don't want this to be carried forward. So what I'm going to do is actually go to the frame that I like, which is frame 300, and hit Control D. So now I've got a separate piece of mesh, but it still has a bunch of inputs. And I'm going to take all of our cloth sim and actually delete it. Now we still have our duplicate object, but you can see that we still have a couple of nodes here. We got output cloth, and this actually leads to some issues down the road. So what I'm going to do is actually export this piece of geometry as an OBJ. Export selection. Then I'm going to go to our project folder. I'm just going to create a new folder called models. And inside this, I'll just call it tablecloth. And I'm actually going to restart my scene. And then I'm actually going to delete this object completely because I want to start completely fresh with the object that we created. Now I'm going to go to File, Import, and bring this tablecloth back into the scene. Notice that I want to uncheck namespaces this time so I don't have to deal with that. Import. And now when I look at the attributes of this tab, it's simple. We've got the transformation, the shape, initial shading group. That's nice and simple. That's exactly what I want. For good measure, I like to delete history just in case. Let's turn our materials back on, turn off the default shader, and we can reveal our characters back again. So what we want to do now is create a material for our tablecloth. We're going to go up to Substance, Apply Workflow to Maps. Select Maps, and just navigate to this material folder wherever you downloaded this material, and hit Select. Hit Apply. Now we're going to go up to Hypershade, and you'll notice that all of the materials in our scene now have red text on it. Red text on materials indicates that these are referenced assets, so they're not actually inside the scene. However, the material that we just created for the tablecloth is in fact created inside the scene, And I can tell because this material has black letters and the thumbnail matches the texture. So I'm just going to call this material tablecloth. And we're just going to right click and assign material to selection. So now we got a nice tablecloth. Let's take a look at how this looks in render. So we're going to go to the render cam. And so this is looking pretty good. I am noticing a little bit of faceting on this tablecloth. So we actually need to add some subdivisions. I'm going to select the tablecloth and hit Control A. Then we're going to go to the shape tab and Arnold, and then subdivision, Cat Clark, and let's set this to 3. And yeah, that smoothed out the edges just a little bit. So now it's just a matter of posing and set dressing our scene. We could pose the characters first, or we could add the decorations so that we know how to pose the characters. It's all up to how you want to approach it. Personally, to me, I think we should do some set dressing on the table so that we know what the characters can interact with, and then we can get more creative with the posing. Let's save our work. Before we get into it, I'm actually just going to go to Explorer where I have my assets downloaded and simplify some of the names that come from fab.com. There's too much information in this and they're too long and messy. So for example, banquet, I'm just going to call this food, lamb ribs, and all this stuff at the end here. I'm just going to delete this. I want simple names and simple file paths. All right, so let's get some food. We're going to go to import the lamb ribs. I'm just going to rename this real quick. Lamb ribs. You can call this Geo is a convention. Another convention is mesh. You can call it. It really depends on your studio and your convention. Next, we're going to go up to substance, apply workflow to maps, select the maps. And actually there's 4K and 8K in this set. So we're just going to do with 4K. That's more than enough. Now you notice that there's AO again. This is kind of more of a utility shader for this purpose. You can use it to make more advanced looking materials, but it's not going to do much just like this. Also, there's actually displacement textures for these assets. And so you can use it if you want, but I don't really believe in using JPEGs for displacement and it's not really going to make that much of an impact. So I'm going to ignore it for now. We're going to hit apply. Because I know it's the only Arnold material in the scene, we can just go down to assign existing and AI standard surface. And just hit 6 to activate textures inside of your scene to see it. Next, I'm just going to rename this material. So I'm going to call it material ribs. And we're just going to set system to GPU. We need to check out our material. Also, you can set this as a preset so you don't have to do this every single time. I'm just doing it to show you that this is what I do, is set it to GPU all the time. Next, we're going to create a light physical sky, bump this exposure up to 2. And set viewport sky radius to 0. That way we don't see it. So our food's looking pretty good, but actually it's not looking as good as I want it to. Let's open up Hypershade and let's graph this network out. Let's just click on it. And really what I'm not happy with is the roughness. It's not shiny enough. I think to look a little juicier, we need a little bit of specularity. So I'm actually going to disconnect the roughness. Whenever you see this black arrow in this little box, this means that there's something connected. So we're just going to right click on roughness and hit break connection. That disconnects the roughness material. And now I can reduce the amount of roughness and get a little bit of specularity. I don't need it to be like super shiny. I just want a little bit of glinting. There you go. Like make it a little juicy, a little saucy. We got to turn down the roughness just a little bit. Make it look a little bit more appetizing. And that looks better. Like that looks kind of tasty, right? So maybe that's too high and we need to see it in the context of the scene maybe. So I'll just turn it down just a little bit. Let's do 35% specularity. So that's one thing to keep in mind is I'm not a huge fan of the roughness on these textures. That's good enough for now. I'm not going to rig this. We don't need that. That would be overkill. I just want to show you how to set up these materials and we need to do this several times for all of the assets. Go ahead and delete that light. Now I'm going to set project. Food, lamb ribs, that's where I want to set my project. I'm going to go to create default workspace. Now I'm going to save the scene. Food, lamb ribs. I'm just going to call this food, lamb ribs master. Good enough for me. Next, file, import. And this is just repetition at this point, getting used to using the Substance plugin to set up assets for you. Let's get some roasted quail in here. Let's get the FBX up. Looks good. Same thing. Substance, apply workflow to maps, select maps. Only 4K this time. I'm going to manually link the AO, hit apply. Pretty good. Assign existing AI standard surface, right click materials. Let's hit 6 in the viewport so we can see our textures. MTL. I'm just going to call this a chicken. Once again, I'm just going to break connection. Now this may not be the best idea. You really should check out every asset in the lighting conditions, but I know that this is from the same website. It's probably from the same set of assets of food. So I know that the roughness before was 0.35. Rather than set up the lights and all that every single time, you can take these shortcuts and just try it out. So I'm just going to do chicken, mesh, or geo. Again, doesn't matter. Looks good. Now just to test my theory, let's just set the exposure to 2 And there's a high chance that this chicken's gonna look good. Perfect. Absolutely perfect. To all the vegetarians out there, you guys can go download some celery. So we're happy with this. We're gonna set project, same thing. What's next? Let's do some bread. Import the bread FBX. I'm just gonna bring this above the ground. I didn't actually check that on the last one. Modify center pivot, freeze transform, delete history, and let's rename this bread geo. Let's create a group for that. Bread group. Substance, apply workflow to maps, select maps. Same thing, right click, assign existing AI standard surface, right click, material attributes. Let's rename material bread. Hit 6 on your keyboard, looks great. Because this is not a juicy chicken, this time we're gonna add some lights and we're actually gonna check it out. Exposure to 2. And in this case, I don't need the bread to be specular. I feel like that wouldn't quite make sense. A little bit was probably okay, but I think just like this is perfectly fine. This looks really good. Delete the light, set project, save scene, bread, master, done, save. We have a bit of a unique case here with the grapes because I just noticed that this asset came with a transmission mask, and I'm gonna show you how to set that up. So I'm just gonna open up the hypershade, let's graph out our network. And if we scroll down to transmission, you'll see a bunch of settings here. As you can see, if we bump up the weight, the object becomes completely transparent, but obviously that doesn't work for the stem. So we need a mask to outline the areas that will be transparent. So this is where we're going to attach the transmission texture, and the substance plugin doesn't automatically set this up for us. Click on file, and we're just going to navigate to the grapes texture folder and plug in the transmission map. And you're going to notice that that had no impact on the weight. We're still completely transparent. So what we need to do is click on the texture node that it created. We can see our transmission texture right here. Down at the bottom, you want to hit alpha is luminance. And there we go. Now we get a solid stem with no transparency, and portions of the grapes become transparent. From here, we can start adjusting the color. So if you wanted a more yellowy green grape, or a darker, more reddish grape. So this is a super cool texture to play with. So now you should be pretty familiar with prepping assets from fab.com for Maya and Arnold. And at this point, it's just a matter of a lot of repetition. In total, I prepared about 30 different assets just like this for the scene. I don't suggest doing all of that because even though it's not super difficult, it does take a little time. And I think if you're actually trying this out yourself, you should just start with one asset. Try to do one. It's much better to do a good job at one thing than a bad job at a lot of things. And for each one, it's the exact same workflow. In addition to the assets from fab.com, I'm going to provide you a few assets that I modeled myself, except for this flower vase that came from cgtrader.com. It was a free asset that I converted for Maya and Arnold and set it up for you guys because it was a little complex to do, so I just did the work for you. As well, I'm going to include this very simple glass of orange juice, a candle, which I'll show you how to model in chapter 2, a very basic fork and knife, and last, a very simple little napkin. Just little things to help you out. Finally, this is kind of the fun part where we just get to add assets to our scene. So I'm going to switch to split screen here, and I'm going to set this left side to our render cam so we can see what the shot looks like. And not that we have a locked off shot or anything, but it is a good practice to lock this camera by hitting the lock button right up here. That way it doesn't move. And I'm going to switch this to a textured view and disable the control shapes by hitting Alt-1. So now we can work in the scene and still have that camera view present if we should want it. Next, we're going to go up to File, Create Reference, and start bringing in some of our assets. I'm going to bring in the flower vase. And again, the scale might be off for some of these. They could be too big or too small, so we'll just adjust it accordingly. Give ourselves a little bit of decoration here. And the first thing is I'm just going to bring them in, roughly place them, and we can get more refined after that. File, Create Reference, fork and knife. Okay, I made this a little too big. And we're going to have to bring in 2 of these because obviously we got 2 guests here. Create Reference again, same thing. And references really help to keep the performance of your Maya scene light and responding quickly. Just holding J to snap as I rotate that around. And I'm realizing actually we don't have a dinner plate, so we might have to model a dinner plate. Now, as we bring in assets, you can see that the display layers are getting kind of cluttered. But one thing we can do is set colors for our display layers, and that's probably what I'm going to do now, is just set a color so that I know what's important. So I think the dog, obviously our main characters are super important, so the dog and the control shapes, geo and the control shapes are extremely important. And so I've just quickly labeled those for now so that we can keep track of them in the scene. Now notice how the fork and knife is black inside of the viewport. That's because it's purely metallic. It has no base color. So it's just reflecting the light from in the scene. And that's why the HDRI is useful. Even if we don't ultimately use the HDRI, at least there's something that metallic objects or glass can reflect in the background. That's important. So that's why they look like that. I'm gonna bring in our juice. It's missing part of the mesh, so maybe something was wrong. Oh, okay, it's just not showing up in the scene because it's transparent and I have textures on. So I've set this to wireframe, you can see it show up now. And I might just time lapse this part so that you can watch as I set the table, but all I'm doing is bringing in these assets, nothing fancy. Now remember, our food doesn't actually have a rig, so we're just gonna be dealing with the geometry directly. That's okay. I'm gonna probably give the dog the lamb rib. That's probably something that he'd like. And again, look how much stuff we're bringing into this scene, but it's running nice and smooth. We're not being burdened by a ton of files inside of the actual scene because everything going on here is a reference. We are definitely in need of some plates. I think our table's getting a little full. I think the only thing I'm really missing right now is I really think we need a little bit of nutrition balance here. We could use some vegetables or something green on the table. And let's take a look at what things are looking like in render. Man, this is looking awesome. This looks great. You could stop at any point, but I'm going to keep going until I'm happy with the scene. One of the things that's really jumping out to me is the dog really could use some fur. This is where XGen comes in, but I'm going to have to leave that for another time because I just simply can't fit all that information into one video and your heads will completely explode. So really, you can take this as far as you want, and it's just a matter of the same concepts. We're just bringing in things, we're going to pose things, and make it look as good as we can. But I'm actually really happy with this. This is looking fantastic. Now the background doesn't really match. I'm not super happy with the lighting. We really could use some color correction. There's just a ton of warm orange yellow cast going on. That's not exactly what I wanted because literally you can only see orange in this scene. So we need to balance our colors a little bit, but we'll work on that. Let's pretend that we were really happy with this and we wanted to render a proper frame out. I'll show you how to do that right now. So here, setting your format is really important. EXR is the standard for 3D. This is extremely high quality stuff, massive amounts of latitude inside of an EXR. But you can set that to PNG or whatever you want. I recommend just sticking it on EXR. And you can change the resolution here. So we could do 1920 by 1080. And what you do is you go up to Arnold. You can open in Arnold render view or you can hit render current frame right here. But I'm going to do it in Arnold render view. Then we can just hit play and let this render out. Now we're not even at the highest render quality settings. We're at pretty low render quality settings, but this is more than good enough for something like Instagram or whatever. Then you go up to File, Save Image, and let's save it to our project under Images, and I'll just do Render Test 1, and I'll save it as a PNG. And let's go look at what that looks like. And here we go. So it's looking great. That's the overall workflow, but we're going to keep pushing it. All right, let's model some plates. I know you guys have been itching to do some modeling. So let's create a cylinder. I'm just going to scale it up so we can see it. I'm going to go to the inputs here. See, you actually do use inputs sometimes. And I'm going to set the subdivision axis to about 48. Kind of want it to be a little bit smoother. That's okay with me. And then the next one is cap. I'm going to set that to like 6. I just want to get a little bit, maybe that should be enough. Then I'm going to right click, go to face. Select all the bottom half of the faces here and then hit delete. I just want this top plane just by itself. And now we actually need to center this pivot. Let's talk about shelves real quick. You can go up to modify, center pivot to center the pivot, but I want you to hit Control Shift and that's going to create your first button on your shelf because we use center pivot quite a lot and especially for modeling, it's going to be really useful. So now the pivot's in the middle of the object. This is perfect. I'm going to select edges and just select this outer edge and hit B. And if you hold B and left click while moving left and right or up and down, you can see that we can grow or shrink the amount of influence that we have. So we kind of just want to affect some of the edges on the inside as well. And I'm just going to lift that up. And maybe our influence is a little bit too strong, so I'm just going to reduce it. I just want to get a subtle movement, just to give the plate just a little bit of lift around the edges. And that is pretty much a plate, or at least a version of a plate. Now what we can do is shift right click. Let's go to Insert Edge Loop, and we're just going to add not that many. Let's bring up our modeling tool options here. I had it on 6. I'm just going to set it to 1 and set it to relative, and this allows me to slide it along the edge here. I'm just going to eyeball it. I kind of just want to add maybe a loop about there. Hit Q, select the outer edge, and just bring it downwards a little bit. Again, just using soft select, I'm just going to control it just a little bit, not too much, just a subtle one. So now we're going to add a little bit of thickness to this. There are 2 ways. I'll show you both ways right now. So one way is that you could go to face and double click everything and then go to shift right click extrude, and then you can set a thickness. And that would be our plate. Now that's a little bit thick. Let me undo that. Let's do it again. Shift right click extrude. Sure, maybe something like that. Cool. And if you want to preview what that looks like smooth, you can see it like this. Do you want the rounded edge? Sure, maybe you do. Do you want a little bit of a firmer edge on the inside? Shift, right click, insert edge loop, And you can add a reinforcing edge kind of around the edge here to get a little bit more of that border. And we can preview it in sub D by hitting 3. That looks pretty good. Another way that you can create thickness inside of Maya is that we could take this object and hit Control D to duplicate it. Then you can right click, go to vertices, select all the vertices, hit W for the translate tool, hold W and left click. We're going to set the axis for these vertices to normal. And you see this N, this stands for normal axis right here. We're going to just drag along this normal. And you can see that we can actually give the model a little bit of thickness by moving like that. So this is a very common way to add thickness inside of Maya. So you can go as thick as you want with that. And that's probably about good for me. And now, because we have two faces that are aiming the same direction, we actually need to take the bottom one and flip it. So we're going to take this bottom piece of mesh here. We're going to go to face, double click, shift right click, face normals, reverse normals. So we want the normals to point the other direction. So now we got top side and bottom side. Select both objects here, shift right click and go to combine. So now that they're one mesh, select the top ring, double click the border, hold shift, double click the bottom border, shift right click and bridge. And so now you have thickness like that. Now you notice that we have some faceting on the sides here. This is just an edge smoothing error. So we can go back to edge, select one edge here and double click the second to create a ring select around the whole model. Hold shift, right click, soften, soften edge. And now we have a thick plate like that. Let's preview smooth on this one. Again, same thing. Potentially you might want to add an edge crease. Now pay attention to how much history is going on with this object and this object. This is a good time to freeze transformations and delete history, freeze transformations and delete history. Now we are still in the normal move select, so some of the tools aren't working properly. So hold W and left click and set it to world. Now we have our gizmo back. Now I'm just going to take these plates, hit Control D and make copies, because maybe we could do like a little bit more ornate one. I'm just going to go to edge, double click on this edge here, and I'm going to hit bevel. And what that does, you can click and drag fraction here to make it wider, thicker. I just want to create a little bit of a gold trim. If you want a little bit more subtle control, you can hold Control on your keyboard while dragging this. You get a much more subtle control of this right there. And that looks about right to me. So now I'm going to convert this to face select. I'm going to hold shift, double click to create this ring, shift right click, and we're going to extrude. Create a bit of an extrusion there. And you notice that the extrusion is shooting straight up. That's completely normal. But actually I want to taper it, so I'm going to use the offset. Again, you can hold Control to get a little bit more subtle control there. Maybe reduce the thickness by a little bit. I just want to create a little bit of a trim along the edge. I'm going to add a few reinforcing edges to this. So I'm going to add an edge here and an edge here just to kind of tighten up this detail. And when we smooth this, you'll see what that looks like. Kind of crisps it up just a little bit. All right, so we got some plates, and we can always change the size of these later. But now I just want to immediately toss it into render. Because we have no textures to load, it's really nice for that purpose. So I'm just going to make sure I select each object. I forgot we have to set subdivision on each one. So on the shape tab, go down to Arnold, subdivision, Cat Clark. Let's set each one to 3. And you can just do the same for each object here. Cool. Now I'm going to assign a new material to these. So right click, assign new material, Arnold AI standard surface. And we're actually just going to use an Arnold preset. So we're just going to go to preset and let's do ceramic. Let's do replace. And the last thing I just want to show you is if you wanted to add like a little bit of a gold trim to, let's say, this detail that we added, you can do that. So we're just going to hit shift, double click to select the loop. And then we're going to hit right click, assign new material, Arnold AI standard surface. We're going to rename this material gold. And with this one here, we're going to go preset, gold, replace. And it's going to be a little easier for this one. We're just going to right click, assign existing material, material gold. So here you can see our plates. We've got a gold trim on these now. Just a little bit of detail. So now we're truly ready to decorate. We've got everything we could possibly need and more. I've got this new folder called Extra Assets. These are all the different things I added. I got some veggies, I got some bread, and we also got some plates. So let me bring in those plates first. All of them are on the ground for now. And honestly, I don't know which one to start with. We can give the dog the gold trim plate. Maybe I'll scale one down just to get some variety of shape on the table. So the bread loaf maybe could go on the bigger plate. It's a lot of bread. By the way, I'm trying to make a scene, I guess, that's going to be ridiculously unrealistic for these two characters. There's no way they'd be ordering this food, but this is going to be a feast, courtesy of FAB.com. Now we just have to make sure to position things in such a way that it doesn't clip through the models, because that will ruin the illusion. I'll definitely time lapse some of this stuff so you guys don't have to sit here and watch me fiddling, but essentially that's what I'm doing. Is I'm currently just moving things around, set decorating. There's nothing technical to know about this. This is pure just what you want to do with your project. Now I want to point out that if you have a model like these little grapes here, and let's say I want to make a copy of these, if I just select the model and I hit Control D, you'll notice what happens is that the model actually became part of the scene. It lost its blue diamond. So by duplicating reference geometry, it actually becomes a real version inside of this scene. That's not necessarily desirable. So I'm just going to undo that, make sure I undo that. When you bring in an asset that's not rigged, you have two things that you're selecting. If you select in the outliner here, you're actually selecting the group and not the mesh. If you select the mesh, for example, like this, you can see if I move it off to the side, I have two things that I can select. The group is still at world 00, the mesh is over here. So decide which one you're going to select. I'm going to get some vegetables in here. I think some steamed carrots would be nice. And this is why I said that navigation is so important, because this is a big part of what it takes to work inside of Maya. And I'm not just trying to be different. I just truly believe that modeling is secondary to these other skills. Get comfortable with this stuff first. Make a scene. You'll realize what the challenges really are. And modeling is a bottomless pit. Okay, so food's looking great. Good to know. And as I mentioned before, like stylistically, yeah, I know the dog doesn't quite fit, but it's fine. The food's probably way too realistic for both of them, but it's fine. It's my world. I'm just going through and bookmarking potential angles that I think are kind of cool. Well, let me see what happens, what the scene looks like if I dim the exposure. And this is probably what I want. I want something a little dimmer, just as a base, and then we can set the lights ourselves. Now tell me this, guys. Does the fork go on the left or right of the napkin? Does the point of the napkin point to the left or to the right? This is the perfect opportunity to add like a little bit of story in any which way you can. So for example, the dog's not going to use the utensils, but she will. So the utensils I expect to be completely untouched. If anything though, maybe they're like knocked off to the side just a little bit. Now this tablecloth keeps getting in my way because it's not part of anything. So I'm going to create a new layer for it and just call it tablecloth. Just so that I don't keep selecting it. There's always so many things to think about. I actually like having the white of the bread not completely dominating the shot. It's almost a little too distracting having it face us. So you got to be thinking about this composition all the time. And I actually like how it was before. One hotkey that's really cool is if you hit Control and Spacebar together, you go into expert mode. And this is kind of nice if you already have a pretty firm grasp of hotkeys and you don't really need too much. This is really nice. So I'm just going to position these pretty quickly like this. And it's nice because it gives you just a full screen. As you know, so much of Maya is already inside the hotbox and all the different hidden menus. So you can get away with not using a UI of any kind. But personally, I think that you need the attribute editor every now and then. These fruits I'm putting into the scene, like I know this is ridiculous in terms of the practicality of how much food is actually on the table, but I'm putting it for color. And because I don't know where exactly I plan to put the camera, it kind of helps to be able to have some business going on. I mean, most likely I'm probably taking from this angle because I want the main character to be facing the camera. The dog is less important, although obviously I'd love to have both of them kind of in the shot. So we'll figure something out, but I'm just covering my bases and I want it to be visually cluttered, but there's probably a way to compositionally have it point towards, have these fruits and vegetables point towards the character faces, make some kind of circular composition, maybe have some arrows pointing, that kind of thing. That's all 2D design in theory that I should apply to this, but Right now I'm just filling it up with stuff. Now obviously the better graphics card you have, the smoother it's going to be inside the viewport. Just for the record, I'm running a 2080 Ti, so this is several generations old. I built this computer in 2019, so it's been going 6 years strong, and I would kill for a new graphics card, but I want to ride this computer all the way until it dies. So this is obviously before posing. I think I'm pretty happy with the overall arrangement of the table. But to me, this is just looking awesome. And it goes to show you, without too much effort, just being clever with the assets you choose to use, you can get some really cool looking results. I want to point out too that floating assets is definitely something to keep in mind. So for example, I have to be careful about some of these shadows right here. This plate looks like it's floating. This plate's definitely floating. And these are things that are kind of hard to see sometimes inside of the viewport. I think this carrot's floating. So there's all kinds of stuff. You can just kind of tell once you add the lights and the shadows, things start to look like they're floating a little bit. So just got to be careful about that. So these are all things to consider. But man, this is a really cool looking scene. I just want to show you real quick the difference that a different lighting environment can make. And it can be good to switch it up just to change your perspective a little bit. This is a nice HDRI because it's kind of more color balanced. The white balance looks better. And clearly you can see that our dog is kind of standing out as being probably the most unrealistic thing in this scene. I know our character is stylized, but still. So it's really up to you to decide how you want to play the lighting. It can vastly change the mood. With the layout of the table pretty much set, I'm finally ready to start posing. While I was posing, I had no comments to make. I just threw on some music and I started getting into the character. This part of the process is very internal. It's one of those things that you have to feel from the inside. It's a little bit different because I'm not doing true animation, I'm just doing one frame of animation. As much as possible though, I'm thinking about what I'm trying to communicate. What's the feeling I'm trying to express? What am I trying to convey with these characters? What is this opportunity? This is where you can bring life to your characters. You can tell a little story. I can honestly say I haven't animated in a long time, but I had a lot of fun making this scene. I think 3D artists put so much pressure on themselves to constantly be impressive, because we're always trying to impress potential employers. But I also find that pressure holds you back from making your best work. The longer I'm in this business, the more I realize if I have more fun, the work will probably be better. On a technical level, there's not much to add to what we've already covered so far. I'm simply using two tools that we used at the beginning of this video, move and rotate, to position the control shapes. That's it. The acting and performance of the characters is purely up to what's inside of you. And in a way, that's kind of a beautiful thing. Of course, you can always try to copy reference, but if you just kind of improvise and go with it, it kind of feels more like playing with toys, and it's a lot of fun. So what I'm thinking about here as I'm posing these characters, first of all, I'm just having some fun. Second of all, I'm thinking of silhouette. You always have to think about silhouette because that's what's going to read. So originally I had the hand, kind of covering up her torso, but I just felt like that kind of made her look a little too bulky, at least from the silhouette. Like you're losing a lot of detail in that read, and it looks fine, like even just like this. But by posing the arm back, you get better negative space right here. You get a much better silhouette read of her whole shape. So I think that is probably for the best. And I think ultimately what I'll do is I'll probably have the camera pan around like this so we can see it all the way around. And I'm really happy with this. This is looking great. I think I'm almost done the posing. I just want him to be like so excited, like he hasn't dug in yet. And she's kind of like, come on, you're jumping on the table. But at the same time, she loves him. And there's clearly some kind of celebration going on here. Who knows? And she's also kind of like, look at this feast that I got for everybody. And I think there's also this kind of feeling of like, not too bad. We didn't do too bad. We got this massive feast. was worth it in the end. I would love for there to be a pupil control, because that'd make his pupils like a little bit smaller, or at least one of them a little bit smaller than the other. I almost kind of want to emphasize the teeth just like a little bit more. Can I do that? Just want to show like this boy is hungry. Yeah, that's kind of cool. Like, so compare this to this. Yeah, just like a little bit more gum maybe, just to kind of show like, yeah, it's dinner time, boys. Even this shot just by itself, I like that shot, just like that. It's great. Yeah, this is awesome. Perfect. I'm really happy with this. We should probably put some legs on this table. It almost just doesn't seem right without some legs. Okay, what I'm doing right now is I'm just making sure that my objects are in fact touching the surface of the table and that they're not floating. And this is where the viewport setting of ambient occlusion can come into play. So I've just disabled textures because it's just easier to see without everything going on. And right now there's no sense of depth. Like I can't tell where the object is until it actually clips through the top of the table. But if I turn on ambient space occlusion, I can get a little bit of a better gauge. So you can see that there's a little bit of a shadow, and now I can see the contact shadow. So that definitely helps to ballpark. So when I see this little kind of dark halo, I can tell that it's not quite right. And I need to bring it down a little bit. So I'm just trying to eliminate these shadows. I'm not as concerned if the food on the plates are not like completely touching, but like things like these are big mistakes right here. So like this is pretty bad. Damn, that thing's practically flying off the planet. So just doing a little finessing. Now I'm pretty sure the dog is like actually flying off the table. He's not contacting the table at all. Yeah. And in his case, I'm just going to do a global translation down. So I've finished up my cleanup pass. All the items should be properly touching the table, paws included. And now we're ready to start lighting this for real. So I've disabled the HDRI because I don't want that light contribution at the moment. We're just going to start from scratch. So we're going to go up to Arnold, Lights, and create an area light. Now by default, all objects come in at world 000. So I'm just going to scale this up so we can see it and move this up. And what I need to first do is set a key light. So if we start rendering right now, as you know, nothing really happens. So we're going to hit Control A and we're going to make sure we bump up the exposure to something like 15 to start. So now we've got our first light, and I want this to be like the primary light on our hero character here. And instead of just fidgeting around with the gizmo like we've done before, I want to use this panel instead. If you go up to panels at the top of the viewport, you can switch to look through selected. So currently I have the light selected, and now I am the light. I'm piloting the light source. So I can just position myself kind of roughly 3/4 on the main character. And that's just an easier way to position the light, in my opinion. And then when you're done, you can go back out to the perspective camera. So that's a really simple way. I'm just going to lift it up a little bit to position a light. And let's try rendering now. Cool. So I think that needs to be a little bit stronger. Let's bump this up to like 18. That's probably a little too high. And that's okay for our first light. Now you can set the color of the light obviously by hitting this little color box. And you can set it to whatever color you want. However, you can also turn on color temperature, and this is really nice. So you can get cooler lights or warmer lights depending on what you're going for. And so I'll make it slightly warm light. Let's create another light. Arnold, Lights, Area Light. Scale this up huge. Again, I'm just going to go to Panels, look through Selected. And we're going to create a bit of a rim light. And I'm going to make this one pretty strong right off the bat. So without and with. And let's make this one a cooler lamp, just for a little bit of contrast. Now, my goal isn't necessarily to flatten out the lighting on her face. I still want it to come primarily from one side. So I'm going to lower the intensity of one side just a little bit. Now, one little important detail that's kind of important is if you notice the teeth look kind of blacked out, she looks a little creepy. One thing you can do here is actually add a little bit of emission to the teeth because you don't want too much shadowing. Yes, there's shadows that happen in real life, but the way it works in 3D kind of looks a little bit too dark, and stylistically we may want something else. So what you can do is let's click on the teeth here, right click and go to Material Attributes. And we'll look for this one called Dientes. I think that means teeth. And we're going to go down to emission and just add a little bit of emission. We can just leave it basic white. And do you see the difference there? We just kind of added just a little bit to counter that shadow. So I don't know exactly how much. We don't want her, like on the extreme end, like her teeth could be glowing, and we don't necessarily want that either. So I think just a little subtle. So this was before and now just like a little bit to kind of help her out a little. So something like that for now. And just from a distance, it just reads a lot better to have her teeth coming through those shadows just a little bit. Cool. Let's add a little bit of a fill light. So I'm going to create another one, lights, area light. And you can just adjust this to your liking. Do whatever you think looks cool to you. Again, I'm going to go to look through selected. Don't mind the clipping. That's just the light. I kind of just want to give a subtle fill to the whole thing. And I'm just focusing on her right now. I'm not worried about the dog just yet. So let's try 14. Might be a little strong. Color temperature, we'll cool it down. Let's try 15. It's a little too much. And I want it to come more from the top, I think. So let's just... Cool. I'm going to make the rim light a little bit stronger. I'm also going to narrow the width of the light. And so it's just a bit of a balancing act. You kind of just keep playing with it, pushing the lights here and there. I'm also going to make this main light a little bit narrower. I just want a little bit more focus on her as opposed to lighting the entire table. I'm not quite happy with my rim light. I feel like it's not quite hitting where I want it to. The other thing you can do is you can go down to light filters and hit add, and we can add a light decay. So light actually falls off if we double click this, and we can just have it drop off. So you can see right around here, it starts to fall off on her edges. Right now you can see the cloak is getting hit, but I can have it drop off a little bit. On and off, on and off. Okay, next we're going to create one more light here, scale it up in the scene, and I'm just going to add a little bit of warmth coming from the right side. Just a bit, something like that, and probably push the light back. Start with 12, color temperature, and make it pretty warm. Okay, so I'm just going to revisit some of the lights real quick. I'm going to balance some things out. Going to make the lights a little bit more gradual. So maybe that one was too hot. What was it at? It was at 15. It brought it down to 14. Maybe let's see what happens if I make it a little warmer. So that's maybe a little too saturated for me. And all the while, we have to pay attention to how her face looks because it's important to light that properly. Okay, that's too strong of a light. Let's make that a little cooler. I'm just going to open up the spread just a little bit. Cool. So that's looking pretty nice. So play around with your lights, get something you're happy with. Now I'm going to do a little lighting that's just focused on Douglas. So once again, just going to create another light here. He's a very happy looking boy. Okay, that's looking pretty nice just as a start. I don't want the light to hit his chest so much as his head. Like I want the head to be more of the focus than like underneath his neck. So I'm just going to try moving the light up a bit so that we get more of that focus on the head. Now I'm just going to create another light. And I think I want to try and get a bit of a rim on just him. And I'll keep it on the cool side. Okay, sort of. I feel like a paparazzi catching this dog in action. Yeah, that's kind of what I wanted. Now I'm going to try and bump up the lighting of our candle. So I'm going to lights, area light, create a little candle light. And I'm going to make it insanely strong just so I can see it. And right here where it says light shape, you can actually change that from quad to something like cylinder. So it does like more of an overall glow. Let's bring that down. And this is probably also a good one to put decay on. So we're going to add a decay. Color temperature, make that warm. And for the decay, use far attenuation. And that looks really nice like that. Before and after. So if you like that, now I can just duplicate it with Control D and move it over for the second candle. And let's see how that looks. So that's looking nice, but it looks like when you duplicate a light, it loses the decay filter. So the light's a little bit too strong right now. So let's just add a decay. It'd be nice to get to kind of underlight the dog a little bit better. Like that. That looks pretty cool. I feel like it'd be a little dangerous to have the flame right in front of him, so I wouldn't, but stylistically it looks cool. But at the same time, YOLO, let's see what happens if I put it right here. Maybe I move it off to the side just a little bit. That's the closest I can get it. And it also seems like a weird place to put a candle in the first place. Why would a candle be off in front of the plate? But yeah, it pretty much looks awesome. So I'm gonna move the candle back just because it just doesn't make sense to have it there, but maybe there's something else I can do. But you can definitely see how authoring your own lights as opposed to just using an HDRI gives a completely different mood. You can really set the scene and it looks great. Now that we have our lights in place, this is actually where we can turn the HDRI back on. We want the HDRI also for the background, but we're gonna keep it pretty low at like -3 for starters, because we don't want to have so much light from the HDRI plus the lights that we added. And let's just turn that on and see how everything looks. And that feels great. So you can see that kind of fills in, and I'm actually gonna hide the background plane for now. I think if anything, what we might need is a second candle under the dog. But this is feeling pretty nice. I think we could use another light kind of aiming at the flowers to pick up some of those edges. Maybe something kind of cool, just like this one. And a little bit more on him as well, kind of the edging. And let's see what happens if we bump up the exposure on the HDRI just a little bit to give it a little bit more brightness. Okay, that's nice. I don't know if I like it better, but it's brighter, so that's good. Maybe just a half step. So I'm gonna noodle with the lights a little bit longer, but essentially that's it. We just create some area lights. We played with the size of them a little bit, played with the exposure, the color temperature, the spread, and then finally the decay. We added, basically we're setting a fall off here so that the light doesn't go forever. It falls off at this value here. I think I want a little bit more focus on her plate of food. So I'm gonna focus on this key light here. I'm gonna try changing the shape of this light to a disc instead. It has this, because I don't want to catch the bottom as much. I really just want it to be more like a spotlight. And so the disc is kind of nice for that. Now I can reduce the intensity. Okay, scene's looking great. Okay, now there is an interesting feature that you may be interested in, and we're gonna go up to the render settings and go to Arnold Renderer Environment, and here where it says Atmosphere, we're gonna create AI Atmosphere Volume. And what that does is it allows you to get a bit of atmosphere in the scene, so the scene's about to look a whole lot different. Okay, so right now nothing has changed, but if we add just a tiny bit of density to the scene, you can see how it adds a little bit of haze. Now it doesn't work so great when you have a ton of lights like we do. Let me try reducing this one in particular. This one's kind of killing the vibe. But this is how you can kind of get that smoky, hazy kind of look to your lights. The candles in particular look incredible. If you activate this, if you like this kind of hazy look, then you'd have to take down any light that was way too bright. So this one's right now at a 20 exposure. So whether or not you decide to use it, it's totally up to you, but just know that it's there. And then the other settings I want you to be aware of is if we do open up the Arnold render view as opposed to using the viewport render view, and we go up and we hit play, there are some special effects that you can add if we click on display settings over here on the right. And we're gonna add an imager, we're gonna add lens effects. So things like bloom are camera effects. These are not part of the renderer's ray tracing. So the renderer bounces light rays across the scene to calculate what the color of each pixel should be. But the things like bloom, chromatic aberration, lens distortion, all of that stuff happens on the camera. It's the camera that creates those characteristics. So by adding this lens effects imager, here's where you can add things like bloom. So if you want to add bloom to your scene, you can totally do that. Typically this is done at the compositing stage. So usually you'll send your renderers out to Nuke and then you add this in the Nuke pass, but you can just bake it in directly into your render. So we can add like a little bit of a vignette if we wanted to. But really, I think the thing that people are longing for when you get into rendering is you kind of want that bloom. At least I know I did. Let's make the radius a little bit bigger. And turn the strength down. We just want like a subtle one maybe at best. One of the things that's happening is that our invisible light source is creating the bloom, but not like the flame itself. So it's a bit of an issue. So use bloom responsibly. You can also change the threshold to affect what level of brightness is affected by the bloom. The more you drop it, the more relaxed the tolerance is. So you can easily get like extreme bloom everywhere. So in this case, our dog is blooming, which is probably a little too strong. So you can add atmosphere and you can add bloom directly inside of Maya, inside of Arnold. You can also disable these effects by just clicking this button right here. And you can just leave it off. Those settings that you keep there will stay on in the background. And then whenever you're ready to turn them back on, you can just do that. So I can just disable it and keep those settings as they are if I like it. So you can apply it to other camera views. We have one last feature that I want to talk about. We're going to switch to our proper render cam and actually get a shot here. I'm just going to hit Alt-1 to hide the control shapes. What I want to talk about now is depth of field. So to do this, we can go to our render cam over here, and you'll notice that there's a depth of field category on your camera, but that's actually not where we're going to mess with it. We're going to open it up inside of the Arnold tab because we're dealing with Arnold renderer. This one up here, you'll notice there's like a lot of duplication of settings in Maya. That's because there's Maya's default and then there's Arnold renderer, but Arnold is a part of Maya natively. Where you actually want to enable depth of field is not this tab here, it's down here under Arnold. You want to enable depth of field. So by clicking this, I've enabled depth of field. But the problem is that you need to know the distance to camera. So let's say I want to focus on the character's face and not anything as much in the table. So she'll be sharp, the rest of it I kind of want to be blurred out. What I need to know is how far the character is from the camera. And I've deliberately enabled the character geometry inside of the channel box. So right here, the pilot, I unchecked the R so I can click on her mesh. So I'm going to click on her mesh, but what we need is to go up to display, heads up display, and object details. And you'll notice in the upper right hand corner of your screen, now we have this thing that says distance from camera. So when I click on an object, you can see that the values change here. So this muffin is 76 units from my camera. Her face is 202 units. So keep that in mind. You don't need to be exact, but just 202 units. So now I'm going to go back up to the render cam and let's turn on rendering inside of the viewport. And if I just hit Control A to go to the attributes, we have here focus distance. Currently it's set to 5. We're going to set it to the value of that face, which was 202 units. So we're going to say focus distance is 202. That's where we want it to focus. And now where it says aperture size, this is where we start to get the depth of field. So 202, and now we're going to bump up the aperture size. Okay, you may not quite see it just yet. I'm just going to turn off resolution gate so we can see the bigger image. So as you increase the aperture size, you'll notice that the rest of the world gets more blurry. And I'm just going to crank it. So now you can see that the foreground is blurred out and our character's face is in focus. We can go even more extreme, but that's actually such a cool picture right there, to the point that I actually want to save this. So here we are in the Arnold render view. We can open up and switch to camera shape. So if you want an easy way to save your renders, you can go up to Arnold, open Arnold render view, render it in here instead, and then you can save out images like this very easily. Let's crank it even more. And finally, let's try something crazy. Let's see how far we can push this. This can easily crash your computer though, so just be careful. This is expensive to render, but look at that depth of field that we're getting right now. Now, alternatively, that was looking at something that was 202 units away. If we selected a closer mesh, let's say we've got this fork here, it's 67 units away. So let's see what happens when we do a closer up depth of field shot. So we're just gonna select render cam again, focus distance. This time, let's just do 70 and see what happens. So now the hero character is completely blurred out and we've got a nice, very shallow depth of field here on a little bit of the fork. This is where film and photography knowledge comes into play. So you can set things like your aperture blades, all this stuff. It really helps, honestly. Let's try 100. So that's depth of field, guys. So we've dealt with atmosphere, how to add bloom in the imager effects, and finally depth of field. These are all lens effects that can make your scene look even more photorealistic. The last thing I'll mention again is just to go up to your common settings here. You can set your resolution. Arnold renderer, you can bump up the quality. The simplest slider to increase your overall quality is to increase your AA. Every time you add 1 to this camera AA, it'll exponentially increase render time. You can also enable adaptive sampling with max AA camera of about 45 to get some really nice results. The settings that we have out of the box are just fine for stills, but when you get into animation, you will start noticing noise with these settings. So if you want to increase, again, bump this up to like 5 to 6 and enable adaptive sampling. The last thing I wanted to mention is that if you want to bring this into compositing, you can add your AOVs here. So I'll add a couple just for demonstration. So I'm going to add normal, Z depth, albedo, all of the direct and indirect. So diffuse direct, diffuse indirect, specular, direct and indirect, transmission, and that's good enough for now. And so what happens is when we go up to the Arnold render view and we render this particular frame that we're currently on, normally what we have right out of the box is just the beauty pass, but now because we activated AOVs, we've got things like normal, we got Z depth, which you can't see because there's values above 1, but if you bring it into Nuke and you set the exposure, you can see the information in there. We've got albedo, diffuse direct, diffuse indirect, so this is the light that bounced once, specular direct, specular indirect, and transmission. So there's all kinds of AOVs that you can add for complete control, and this can all get saved into one EXR file. So you can go up here, save multi-layer EXR file, which I'll do. This tutorial is just meant to be inside of Maya. I'm not going into any other program, so that's it. I really hope you guys learned something from this tutorial. I'd love to see what you make, so feel free to tag me and I'll check out your work. I know we covered a lot of information, but if you just take your time to absorb, maybe watch things over, practice, try it a few times yourself. We covered everything from the UI all the way to creating a final render. And in the next video, I'll talk about modeling. Thank you for watching.
Nothing is impossible.